The heart monitor flatlined at 2:17 a.m., and the chief surgeon stepped back from the open chest, stripped off his gloves, and said, "He's done." Blood was pooling faster than the suction could clear it, a torn aorta, deep and posterior, the kind of wound that textbooks describe only to explain why patients don't survive them. Every person in that operating room went still. The scrub tech looked at the floor. The anesthesiologist stopped adjusting the pressers. And in the back corner, a quiet agency nurse in a paper gown took one slow breath, set down the retractor she'd been holding for 3 hours, and walked forward. Nobody stopped her. Nobody thought they needed to. Before we go any further, if you're new here, subscribe right now, because this channel is where stories like this one live. Stories about the people nobody sees coming. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know exactly how far this story has traveled. Don't go anywhere. You are going to want to see where this goes. The agency sent her over at 11 that night with a canvas tote bag, a laminated badge, and a note clipped to her file that read, in the staffing coordinator's handwriting, "Flexible, reliable. No complaints on record." That was the sum total of what Redwood General Hospital in Portland, Oregon knew about the woman who signed in as Nora Voss. She was 29, according to the paperwork. Her face carried the particular stillness that people tend to mistake for vacancy, wide-set gray eyes that moved carefully but didn't advertise the fact, a mouth that never produced a syllable it didn't need to. She wore her dark hair pulled back tight enough to look severe, and she moved through the hospital's corridors the way a person moves when they have learned, over a long time. And through circumstances not worth explaining, that being noticed is rarely worth the cost. The charge nurse who processed her badge, Delia Marsh, 22 years on the floor, the last 4 in this trauma wing, the last femme in this trauma wing, looked her up and down with the rapid efficiency of a woman who had processed 200 agency nurses and knew within 45 seconds which ones were going to be useful. "You ever scrubbed in before?" Delia asked. "Some," Nora said. Delia handed over the locker assignment without looking up again. Multi-vehicle coming in off I-84. 3 critical, 1 expectant. You'll be in OR-SAR 7, holding retractors and handing sutures when asked. Don't touch anything you haven't been handed. Don't speak unless you're spoken to. And don't make Dr. Harlan wait. He counts it as a personal insult. Understood, Nora said. She said it in the flat, clean way of a person who already knew everything the other person had just told them and was simply confirming receipt. Delia was already halfway down the hallway and didn't register the particular quality of it. ACE OR-7 ran cold the way trauma rooms always ran cold, temperature maintained low enough to slow bacterial growth and keep the surgical team's focus from blurring at the edges during long cases. Nora gowned and gloved at the scrub sink without rushing. Her movements were automatic in the way that certain movements become automatic only after being performed under conditions that leave no room for error. And she ran through the sequence the same way she always did. Wrists first, then backs of the hands, then each finger individually, nails last. She pushed through the OR doors with her shoulder and spent the first 30 seconds doing what she always did upon entering an unfamiliar room. One slow visual sweep, eyes moving without her head turning, cataloging the placement of the crash cart, the suction lines, the instrument table layout, the distance between the anesthesia station and the surgical field. The scrub tech was a man named Jerome, early 30s, with the kind of steady hands that came from either natural aptitude or long practice, or both. The circulating nurse was a woman named Tasha, experienced, moved well, anticipated rather than reacted. Good team. Not that it would matter tonight, because Nora was there to hold a retractor and be invisible. Dr. Garrett Harlan arrived 3 minutes and 40 seconds before the first patient, which told Nora something about him, before he said a word. He was north of 50, silver-haired, with the physical carriage of a man who had been exceptional at something for long enough that he'd stopped distinguishing between his identity and his reputation. He moved into the room with a slight pause. At the threshold, not hesitation, she decided, but performance. The room needed to register his arrival. He didn't look at Nora. She was furniture. She was comfortable with that. The first patient came through at 11:47 p.m., a 19-year-old with a grade 3 splenic laceration and a comminuted pelvic fracture. Harlan moved through the case competently, which was different from brilliantly, but was plenty sufficient. Nora held the deep retractor at the angle Tasha indicated, maintained consistent tension, passed nothing she wasn't asked to pass. From her position, she watched Harlan's hands without appearing to. He had good spatial instinct and mediocre suture economy twice. She counted a second stitch placed to correct the first one, work that could have been done in a single placement. In routine abdominal surgery, it cost nothing. In catastrophic hemorrhage, it could cost 6 seconds, which was sometimes the entire margin. She cataloged it and said nothing. The second patient was already arriving in the trauma bay when Harlan was placing the final skin sutures on the first. The anesthesiologist doctor, Pauline Acker, who had a spare, dry precision that Nora immediately appreciated, called the numbers through the intercom from the bay: BP 58 over palp, heart rate 144, penetrating thoracic trauma, possible aortic involvement. ETA to OR is 90 seconds. Harlan didn't look up. Tell them I'll be there when I'm done. Here, doctor. Harlan, the mechanism is significant, Jerome. Close this. He stepped back, began degloving. I'll be there in 4 minutes. He was there in 6. By then, the second patient was already in active hemorrhagic shock, and the operating room was running on the controlled chaos of a team that was good at their jobs but needed leadership and hadn't yet determined what form it was going to take. The man's name was Thomas Aldrich, 53 years old, a long-haul truck driver out of Bend, Oregon, who had been struck at highway speed by a pickup running a red light at the interchange. He was a large man made suddenly provisional by his own failing biology. Broad shoulders, slack against the table, skin the gray-white of old ash, chest rising in the shallow mechanical pattern of someone whose cardiovascular system was running anesthesic on the anesthesia team's interventions, and nothing else. Dr. Acker had 2 units of O-negative running simultaneously through large-bore peripheral lines, and her eyes on the arterial line, tracing with the focused calm of someone who was managing a situation and needed the surgeon to know it. We're losing ground, she said to Harlan when he came through the door. Not a plea. Harlan went in fast. She gave him that he was fast, and he was decisive, and when he had the pericardium open and the cardiac tamponade cleared in under 90 seconds, the arterial pressure responded, and the room's collective tension dropped a fraction. Nora, repositioned now at the instrument table to give Jerome a break on the suction, watched the field. She kept her face neutral. She counted the suction cycles. She watched the draping of the overhead light and the positioning of Harlan's hands, and she identified the problem before he did, which was not a surprise. The posterior bleeding didn't stop. Harlan probed the cavity, shifted his angle, called for different retraction. Jerome repositioned. Harlan's jaw tightened by a degree. He called for the light to be adjusted. Tasha moved it. He went back in, and from Nora's oblique angle, not ideal, but sufficient, the situation was legible. The bleeding source was posterior and inferior to the heart, tucked in the shadow of the descending thoracic aorta, in the anatomical location that allows surgeons almost no direct visualization and requires either extraordinary tactile facility or a second set of hands positioned in a way that the patient's own chest cavity doesn't easily accommodate. Suction, Harlan said. Jerome delivered it. The field cleared for 4 seconds and flooded again. More suction. I'm at maximum output, Dr. Harlan. I can see what you're at, I said more. The pump is maxed. Acker spoke from behind the drape with the same inflectionless calm she used for everything. He's at 39 systolic. I have one unit left in the room and we're out of stored ONEG until the blood bank responds to the MTP activation. Harlan's hands went still inside the chest. The room produced the specific silence of people who were waiting for authority to speak. He said, "The tear is posterior descending aorta. I cannot achieve adequate visualization from any accessible approach." He said it the way a clinician delivers a finding impersonally, as though it were happening to someone else's patient in a case he was reviewing. The anatomy doesn't permit what would need to happen here. "What are you saying to us?" Acker asked. Harlan said, "I'm saying I've done what this situation allows for." Jerome stared at the instrument table. Tasha stared at the monitor. Acker stared at her numbers. Nobody said the word that was sitting in the middle of the room. Nora set down the basin she was holding. She said, "He's not done." Her voice was the same volume it would have been asking for a supply from across the room, not raised, not strained, just present in the air of the OR, in a way that her voice had not been for the preceding 3 hours. Harlan turned toward her with the expression of a man who has heard a sound that doesn't belong in his environment and is calibrating whether it requires a response. His eyes traveled from her face to her badge. Temporary staff. Back to her face. "Excuse me," he said. "The posterior tier," Nora said. "You can approach it by feel. Visualization isn't available, but the anatomy in a man his size and build is consistent enough that tactile access is possible. It's a different skill set. It's not visualization." Harlan looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly too long. "Who are you?" "Nora Voss, agency nurse." Something crossed his face, not anger yet, but the precursor to it, the particular tightening of a man who has decided that the source of an inconvenience is not worth the energy of genuine irritation. "Agency nurse," he said flatly, loading the two words with what he didn't feel the need to articulate. "I have 26 years of vascular trauma surgery. I've operated in facilities you've probably never seen. And I'm telling you that the anatomy does not permit what you're describing. I need you to step back, stay in your lane, and allow me to manage this patient." "You're going to let him die," Nora said. Still the same register. Not an accusation, a projection. The silence that followed was a different quality from the one before. This one had an edge. "Tasha," Harlan said. He didn't look away from Nora. "Please have someone escort this nurse out of the OR." Tasha didn't move immediately. She was looking at the monitor. The monitor was reading 34 systolic and a heart rate that was starting to irregularize. "Dr. Harlan, Tasha." Nora pulled on a fresh outer glove from the open pack at the instrument table corner. She moved to the head of the field. She would revisit that moment later, not often, but sometimes, in the hours before sleep, when her mind ran through things without asking permission. The decision had not felt large in the moment. It had felt like arithmetic. A man would be dead in approximately 90 seconds if nothing changed, and she was the only person in the room with the specific capability that the situation required. Arithmetic didn't leave much room for the other considerations. She had always been better at arithmetic than at the other considerations. "Remove your hands from my sterile field," Harlan said, with the cold, precise authority of a man who had removed people from rooms before and found it uncomplicated. Nora didn't answer him. She reached into the chest. Her left hand went in posterior to the heart, following the descending thoracic aorta by feel fingertips, reading tissue in the way you read it, when there is no light and no visualization, and the only information available is what comes back through your fingers. She had done this before. Not here, not in a room like this one, not with a team like this watching. But she had done this. Her fingers found the posterior surface of the vessel, traced its curve, found the disruption, the tear at approximately the 2 o'clock position relative to the vessel axis, irregular margins, longer than it had been when it started, because it had propagated under the pressure of a hypotensive heart, still trying to pump against a hole. She moved her thumb against it. The rate of hemorrhage dropped. Not stopped. Dropped, controlled. Enough to work with. "Jerome." Her voice was even, stripped of everything except information. I need a 4mm felt pledget and a double-armed 40 proline on a small half-circle needle. Tasha, arterial pressure every 20 seconds. Doctor. Acker, hold current anesthetic depth and don't adjust vasopressors unless I specifically ask. Nobody moved for 2 seconds. Then Jerome moved. He went to the instrument table and had the pledget and loaded suture holder in her right hand in 8 seconds, not because he'd made a philosophical decision about who was in charge, Nora suspected, but because something in the precision and specificity of the request had bypassed the part of his training that said, wait for attending approval, and activated the part that said, this is a real ask for a real thing, and a man is dying. He delivered the instrument, and she took it without looking down. Harlan said, if you place that suture, I will have your license pulled, and I will have you prosecuted for practicing medicine without. Hold this. Nora redirected Harlan's right hand, already gloved, already in the field, to the retractor angle she had vacated, positioning it by feel with 2 fingers against the back of his wrist. He held it. She genuinely believed he didn't register that he'd done it until later, because his mouth was still moving, but his hand was holding the retractor at the exact angle she'd placed it. She sutured by feel. The first arm of the double-armed proline went in blind. She could not see the posterior aortic wall any better than Harlan could. But she had done this in field hospitals with no OR lights at all in the backs of moving vehicles, in conditions that a surgeon like Harlan had never encountered and that she had spent years trying to forget. The pledgets seated. The second arm went in. She began to tension the knot incrementally, not all at once, because the vessel wall was friable from the sustained hypotension, and premature tension would pull it through the tissue and cost her everything. Slow tension. Consistent. The knot tied with a particular asymmetric tail faster in wet tissue. Holds better under fluctuating pressure, a variation she had developed through repetition in circumstances she had never written up and never would. She tied it 400 times before the night she needed it to matter. 51 systolic, Acker said. Her voice had changed not much, just at the margins, the way a precise person's voice changes when they are watching something they did not expect to see. Jerome said nothing. He was very still. 63, Tasha said. 20 seconds later, 70. Nora held her breath for a count of 5 after releasing her thumb from the posterior surface. The field did not flood. The suture held. She waited another 3 seconds to be certain, because being certain was the difference between walking out and going back in, and then she stepped back from the table. The OR was completely silent. Not the silence of before, not the silence of dread and waiting. Something else. The silence of a room full of people who have just watched something that has no clean category in their existing experience. Nora stripped the outer glove, dropped it in the waste basin, and looked at Harlan. He was standing at the table with his hands at his sides and the retractor still suspended in the approximate position she'd left his hand in, and his face was working through a set of calculations that she recognized because she had seen it before on different faces, and she had never found a comfortable way to respond to it. She said, "He'll need a CT before ICU transfer. The pledget is felt material, not pericardial tissue. It's going to look different on imaging. Make sure your radiology team knows what they're reading before they call it." She walked out. In the scrub sink hallway, she peeled off her gown, dropped it in the linen bin, and stood at the soot sink for 60 full seconds, washing her hands. The hallway was empty. The overhead fluorescent had a flicker in it, a 40-second cycle. She counted two full iterations while she stood there, bringing her breathing down from the elevated baseline she hadn't fully acknowledged until this moment. Her hands were steady. She checked. They were steady. 4 hours and 28 minutes in this hospital. She needed to not be in it much longer. The OR doors opened behind her, and Jerome came through with the particular expression of someone who has just witnessed something and is not yet sure what language to use for it. He stopped when he saw her at the sink, his mouth opened. Then he seemed to realize he didn't know what he'd meant to say. "He's going to be okay," Nora said. "The repair will hold." The Pledgett's well seated. Jerome looked at her hands at the sink. Where did you different places?" she said. She turned off the water, took the paper towel from the dispenser. "You were good in there tonight. The response time on that suture handoff. It mattered." "That's okay. That's not what I'm." Jerome pressed his hand against the side of his head. "Who are you?" "Actually, Nora Voss," she said. She dropped the paper towel. "Agency's nurse." She collected her canvas tote from the locker room, clocked out at the staffing station 3 to 2 a.m. Technically mid-shift, but the trauma census had cleared, and there was nothing requiring her specifically, and signed her name in the departure column the way she always did. Legible, unhurried, the signature of a person who has nothing to explain. She was in the elevator, bag on her shoulder, lobby button pressed when the PA activated. "All available trauma staff, ICU 3. Code blue, ICU 3. All available." She looked at the button she'd pressed. Then she looked at the number 3 on the panel. The elevator descended past 3 without stopping. She was in the lobby in 14 seconds. The exit was 20 feet ahead of her through the automatic doors, and beyond that, the parking structure and her car and the drive back to the month-to-month apartment she'd been renting in a building where the manager worked nights and had never once asked her a personal question. The PA cycled again. "Code blue, ICU 3. Post-surgical trauma patient in cardiac arrest." She stopped walking, stood in the lobby for 4 seconds, pressed the elevator call button. The ICU was organized panic when she came through the doors. 2 nurses doing chest compressions in alternating rotations. The overnight resident shouting medication orders that were not wrong but were not fast enough, doctor. Acker already on the phone from the OR, passing along what she knew about the patient's surgical course. A respiratory tech was bagging. Someone was yelling for the defibrillator. The monitor above the bed showed a rhythm that Nora read in the first 2 seconds after she walked in, and what she read stopped her 1 step inside the doorway. She moved to the bedside. She did not touch the patient. She looked at the monitor rhythm, then at the IV lines, then at the drip bag on the left pole, then at the timestamp on the drip bag's label. The bag had been hung 41 minutes ago. She looked at the port on the primary IV line, the standard access port, the one any visitor or staff member could reach without tools, the one that was used 50 times a day on a busy ICU, and therefore almost never specifically observed. There was a faint resistance at the port seal, the kind left behind when a needle has accessed it and the self-sealing membrane hasn't quite reseated cleanly. She traced the tubing from the port to the bag. She looked at the bag. "Stop compressions," she said. The resident young, end of a long shift, running on reflex, turned to her. "Who are you?" "Stop compressions right now." "He doesn't need compressions." She was already reaching for the IV tubing connector. "Whatever is in that bag is pharmacologically suppressing his cardiac conduction. If you defibrillate him while that's running, you will kill him. Pull the line." "I don't know who you look at his rhythm." She pointed at the monitor. "That is not a primary arrest pattern. That is drug-induced conduction suppression. Look at it." The resident looked at the monitor. His face changed. "Pull it," he said. She disconnected the line herself, clamped it above the port, called for atropine-specific dose, specific concentration, and the crash cart nurse had it drawn before Nora finished the sentence, which told her the crash cart nurse had been doing this a long time and listened well. She administered it. She watched the monitor. At 58 seconds, the rhythm began to shift, the peaked artificial suppression pattern losing its architecture, the heart's own intrinsic cadence reasserting itself against the receding pharmacological interference. Irregular for 20 seconds, then less irregular. Then a sinus rhythm at 92 beats per minute, imperfect but genuine. Thomas Aldrich's blood pressure read 61/42. Not good, but not 0. He needs the tox panel run on the drip bag, Nora said to the resident. Document the port access mark, photograph it, before you replace the line. And you need to lock down this floor right now, because whoever accessed that port did it in the last 45 minutes, and they may still be in the building. The resident was already on the phone. Nora looked at the doorway. The man was standing just outside it, hospital visitor badge clipped to a jacket that was too heavy for an indoor building in August. Eyes not on the patient in the bed, but on Nora, with the specific quality of attention that had nothing to do with the crisis in the room and everything to do with assessment. She had been assessed like that before. She knew what it meant, and she knew what usually came after it. She handed the empty atropine syringe to the crash nurse, said, "Full resuscitation protocol, document everything. Don't let anyone touch that drip bag until the tox team collects it," and walked toward the door. The man moved into the hallway when she moved toward him, not running, but transitioning, the smooth gear change of someone who had mapped the exits and was now using that map. He turned left at the corridor junction, toward the stairwell, not the elevator. The elevator had cameras at eye level and a 15-second wait. The stairwell had cameras only at the landings. He'd scoped it. This was not improvised. Nora didn't run. She moved at the pace of a person who knows the building slightly better than the person she is following, which she did not because she'd been here before, but because she had learned, a long time ago, to read the logic of institutional architecture. The stairwell at the end of the north corridor opened onto the ambulance bay at ground level, staffed, lit, multiple cameras, a terrible exit for someone who needed to leave without being documented. The second-floor junction offered an alternative route to the parking structure via the Skybridge connector. That was the route she would take if she were him. She pushed through the second-floor corridor door before he reached the landing below. He was 40 feet ahead of her, already slowing, already reaching into his jacket, not for a weapon, she read, because a weapon here was too loud and too complicated, but for a phone or a key fob, or the small habitual gestures a person makes when they think they've created enough distance. He heard the corridor door close behind her and turned. 10 feet between them. Empty hallway. 3:21 in the morning. Whatever he had expected the night to produce, it was not this, not her, specifically standing between him and the Skybridge in the flat white light of a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning with her canvas tote bag still over one shoulder. She could see him recalibrating. It took about a second and a half. He moved when she was already moving, which was the only advantage she'd needed. And what followed was not elegant. She hadn't done it in a long time, and her left shoulder was tired from 3 hours of retraction. But it was effective, and it was fast. And when the security officer came through the far door, 40 seconds later, in response to the motion sensor alert, the man in the heavy jacket was face down on the linoleum, with Nora's knee between his shoulder blades and his wrist, controlled at an angle that made any movement a very poor idea. She looked up at the security officer, young, wide-eyed, hand on his radio, with the hesitation of someone who had been trained for situations, but not necessarily this one. He tampered with an IV line in ICU 3, she said. Your patient is Thomas Aldrich, post-operative trauma admission. You need to secure this floor, collect the drip bag from his room before anyone moves it, and call Portland PD. Do it now, please. The security officer called it in. His voice only cracked slightly. Nora stayed where she was, knee in the man's back, and listened to the building change around her, the PA activating with the security alert protocol, the distant, rapid percussion of footsteps on the floors, above the muffled radio traffic from the lobby. She counted the sounds the way she counted everything. 15 seconds. 30. The elevator at the far end of the hall opened. The stairwell door behind her opened. She didn't turn. She identified the footsteps, measured, deliberate, the footsteps of a person who had been walking hospital corridors for a very long time and had learned not to hurry in them. Not a threat, not security, something else. A man's voice said Nora Voss. Not a question. That's what the badge says, she said. A pause. She heard him come to a stop, approximately 6 feet behind her. I was in the observation gallery during the surgery. I watched the repair on the descending aorta. Another pause, careful, she thought. The pause of a person who is choosing their words with the precisions of someone who understands that the next thing they say will matter. I want to know where you learned that knot. The man on the floor beneath her had gone entirely still. So had Nora. The first Portland PD officers came through the far doors at a jog, hands on their belts, and the corridor filled with the radio noise and purposeful movement of the official response beginning. The building was fully awake, now lights up, every floor active. The graveyard shift of Redwood General Hospital transformed into something that had no precedent in its operational history. Nora didn't answer the question. She kept her knee where it was, kept her eyes on the man on the floor, and felt the particular quality of attention behind her patient, certain, the attention of a man who had recognized something and was not going to unrecognize it settle around the corridor like a change in air pressure. Her hands, for the first time since 11 p.m., were not entirely steady. And in the OR 3 floors below, Thomas Aldrich's repaired aorta continued to hold. And her hands, for the first time since 11 p.m., were not entirely steady. The first Portland PD officer to reach her was a woman named Carver, broad-shouldered, mid-30s, the kind of cop who assessed a room in the same 2-second window Nora used and drew similar conclusions. She looked at the man on the floor, looked at Nora's knee in his back, looked at the wrist control, and said, "I've got him." Nora stood up. She stepped back 2 paces and let Carver take over, and she did not look at the man behind her, the one who had said her name and asked about the knot, because she was not ready to turn around yet. She needed 4 more seconds. She took them. Then she turned. He was exactly what his footsteps had suggested, late 50s, medium height, the kind of lean that comes from decades of long hours rather than any deliberate effort. He wore a white coat over a dress shirt with the collar open, and his ID badge read doctor. Warren Kessler, chief of surgery in the font that hospital administration used for department heads. His face was the face of a man who had spent 30 years making calls that nobody second-guessed, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, which was unusual. The calms that she was good at categorizing expressions. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't the particular territorial hostility that Harlan had produced. It was something more careful than either of those. Recognition, maybe, but recognition of what exactly she couldn't yet determine, and that uncertainty was the thing that made her stay still instead of moving. "Dr. Kessler," she said. Neutral. His name was on his badge, and using it cost her nothing. "Walk with me," he said. "I'm still on the police's timeline. Officer Carver has what she needs from you for the next 20 minutes. He glanced at Carver, who gave a single nod without looking up from the man she was cuffing. Kessler looked back at Nora. 20 minutes. Then you can answer the rest of their questions. He said it like a man who had already arranged it, which meant he'd made a phone call. It's meant in the time between the observation gallery and this corridor. And that meant he'd been moving toward this conversation with intention before the ICU code had even resolved. She filed that. She followed him. He took her to his office on the 4th floor, not the conference room, not the consultation suite that chief surgeons used when they wanted to project institutional authority, but the actual working office with the stacked journals on the windowsill and the half-eaten granola bar, on top of the monitor and the framed photo on the bookshelf turned slightly away from the visitor's chair. He sat behind the desk, and she sat across from it, and he looked at her for a moment without speaking. "Tell me about the knot," he said. "It's a suture technique," she said. "Modified tension distribution. Works better in friable tissue under." "I know what it does," he said. "I want to know where you learned it." "I told you. Different places." Kessler opened a desk drawer, took out a folder, and set it on the desk between them without opening it. He rested his hand on it. Not a threat, he wasn't built for threats, she decided. Just placing a fact in the room. I've seen that knot tied once before, he said. 8 years ago. A trauma case that came through the hospital where I was doing my fellowship. Patient was a federal contractor, multiple GSW, arrived in extremely poor condition. The surgeon who saved him was brought in through channels I was never fully briefed on. She was in and out in 4 hours. Nobody on the floor knew her name. But I watched through the gallery window and I've never forgotten the knot. He paused. The tail angle, the tension sequence. Nobody improvises that. It's trained. Nora said nothing. Her name, as far as I was ever able to determine, Kessler said, was Major Evelyn Cross. United States Army, Combat Trauma Specialty. She was officially declared killed in action, approximately 14 months after that case. Helicopter extraction, overseas, classified circumstances. He looked at Nora's face. I read the notice when it came out. I thought about the knot for a long time after that. The office was quiet. The building had settled slightly, the PA alerts cycling down, the acute phase of the incident response moving into its documentation stage. Through the window, the parking structure lights were orange against a sky that was beginning to think about turning gray. Nora said, I'm sorry for your loss. Are you? Major Cross sounds like she was skilled. Kessler was quiet for a moment. He wasn't angry. She would have preferred anger. Anger was predictable, and it had momentum she could use. What he was instead was patient, and patience in a person who already had what they needed was considerably more difficult to navigate. The agency you're registered with, he said, Northwest Flex Medical Staffing. I called them 20 minutes ago. There it was. Their records show a Nora Voss, he continued, licensed RN, 2 years on file, last placement 6 weeks ago at a long-term care facility in Eugene. No trauma experience documented, no OR rotations, no specialty certifications. He opened the folder now, turned it, pushed it across the desk toward her. It was her own intake form, the one she'd signed at the staffing station. That's the profile of a geriatric care nurse. Not a person who can repair a posterior aortic tear by feel in under 5 minutes while managing a hostile attending and a full surgical team. Nora looked at the form. She looked at her own handwriting on the signature line. People develop skills in unusual ways, she said. Nora. He said it differently that time. Not the professional flatness of before. Something that had actual weight behind it. That man in the ICU, Thomas Aldrich, he's alive because of 2 separate interventions that required a level of training that doesn't come from any nursing program in this country. What's in his drip bag is going to come back as a pharmacological agent that's not on any hospital formulary. The man you took down in the corridor is going to have a professional background that's not going to look like anything Portland PD has seen before. He closed the folder. This is not a simple night. And you are not who that badge says you are. The granola bar on his monitor. The photo turned away on the shelf. The journal stack on the windowsill, she read the spines in her peripheral vision. 3 trauma surgery, torture surgery quarterlies. And at the bottom, a military medicine publication from 4 years ago with a bent corner on the cover. She made a decision. Not the decision he was asking for. A different, smaller one. What happens? She said carefully to the patient. Aldrich, what's his status? Kessler recognized the redirect for what it was and chose not to push against it. Stable. BP is holding at 80 systolic, trending up. The ICU team is good. Dr. Acker is staying through the morning personally, which is not something she does without reason. He paused. He's going to make it through the night. Whether he make it through the next depends on what that drip bag tells us and what the man in the corridor tells Portland PD. The man in the corridor won't tell them anything useful, Nora said. You sound certain? I am. Kessler looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the sky had definitely begun to gray. The city was starting to exist again after the particular suspension of deep night, and the hospital was shifting into the early morning register, different staff, different sounds, the building reorienting itself toward the day ahead. "I'm not going to push you tonight," Kessler said. He closed the folder and put it back in the drawer. "But I want you to understand something. Whatever you were before you walked into this building, whoever you were, you saved a man's life twice in the space of 90 minutes. And the people who were in those rooms are not going to forget what they saw. Jerome Pitts has been scrubbing for 11 years, and I have never seen him look like he did when he came to find me tonight." He stood up, which she took as the signal that the 20 minutes were up. "That's not nothing. That's not something you can just clock out of." Nora stood. "I appreciate the conversation, Dr. Kessler." "Warren," he said. She didn't repeat it back to him. Officer Carver was waiting in the hallway with a notepad and the professional patience of someone who had learned not to push witnesses before they'd had a moment. She took Nora through the standard sequence timeline, observations, physical contact with the suspect, relevant statements, and Nora answered each question with the minimum accurate information required, which was not evasion so much as economy. She'd spent a long time learning the difference. She was released at 4:47 a.m. with a case number and Carver's card and a request to remain available for follow-up. She said she would. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the lobby button, and this time she didn't press anything else. The parking structure was nearly empty at that hour, the kind of empty that makes footsteps echo and every car look identical in the overhead light. She found hers a 7-year-old gray Civic that she'd paid cash for in Eugene and that had no tracking, no connected services, and a registration under the same name as the apartment lease. She sat in it for a moment without starting it. She had been in Portland for 6 weeks. She had been in this hospital for 5 hours and 47 minutes. She started the car and drove. The apartment was 12 minutes away, and she made it in 10 because the streets at 5 in the morning belonged to delivery trucks and nobody else. She let herself in, dropped the canvas tote by the door, went to the kitchen, and filled a glass of water from the tap. She drank all of it standing at the sink. Then she went to the closet in the bedroom, moved the hanging clothes to one side, and looked at the bag on the floor behind them. It was a military-grade duffel, olive green, with nothing written on it. She'd been looking at it for 6 weeks and hadn't opened it once. She looked at it for another 30 seconds and then moved the clothes back and closed the closet door. She sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't sleep. At 7:15 in the morning, her prepaid phone, the one she'd bought at a gas station in Salem under no name at all, produced a text message from a number she didn't recognize, which meant it was a number she did recognize in the way that mattered. The message read, "We know you're in Portland. The Aldrich situation is a problem. Call." She looked at the message for a long time. She deleted it. She set the phone face down on the nightstand. At 9:03 a.m., she drove back to Redwood General. She told herself she was going back for the follow-up that Officer Carver had requested. She told herself this in the same way. She told herself a lot of things accurately enough to function on, not quite accurate enough to fully believe. The truth, which she was less comfortable with, was that she had been thinking about Aldrich's blood pressure during the drive. 80 systolic trending up, ICU. Dr. Acker staying through the morning personally. She needed to know he was okay. She was aware that needing to know was a problem. She went anyway. The hospital's morning shift operated at a different register than the night, busier, louder, the particular organized momentum of a major trauma center in full daylight operation. She had no badge. Her temporary staff credential had expired at the end of her shift, and the staffing station had closed her out. She walked through the main entrance with her hands in her jacket pockets and went to the family waiting area outside the ICU, which was technically accessible to anyone, and she sat in one of the chairs near the window and waited. Jerome found her there at 9:41. He was still in his scrubs from the night before, which meant he hadn't gone home, and his face had the specific exhaustion of a person who had been running on adrenaline for 8 hours and was now running on the memory of it. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the chair she was sitting in. He looked at the ICU doors. He came over and sat down in the chair next to her without being invited, which she decided to allow. He's stable, Jerome said. 78 hours if he holds through the day, is what they're saying. Good. Dr. Kessler has been in there twice this morning already. That's his job. Jerome turned his head and looked at her directly. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a person choosing between several things they could say and deciding on the one that was most true. I've been scrubbing in at this hospital for 11 years, he said. I've seen some things. I've worked with surgeons who are genuinely extraordinary at what they do. I've never seen anyone do what you did last night. The technique is specific, Nora said. Not many people have had reason to develop it. That's not what I mean. He was still looking at her. I mean the way you moved, the way you talked to us, the way you knew exactly what the room needed from every person in it, and you just took it. Like it wasn't the first time. Like it wasn't even the 100th time. He paused. Where have you been doing that? Different places, she said. It was becoming a refrain, which she recognized was not sustainable, but was what she had available. Jerome nodded slowly, the nod of a man who had decided to let a thing rest without accepting it. He stood up. Tasha wanted me to tell you that she documented the handoff correctly. Everything Harlan said in that oar, she documented it. The whole sequence. Nora looked up at him. Why are you telling me that? Because, Jerome said, she thought you should know someone wrote it down. He left. Nora sat with that for a minute. She was still sitting with it when the ICU doors opened, and Dr. Harlan came through them. He was in a fresh white coat, which meant he'd gone home and come back, or he kept spares in his office, or he was the kind of man who changed coats the way other people changed expressions to present a different surface to the world. He didn't see her immediately. He was talking on his phone, and his voice had the clipped, brittle quality of a man managing a conversation he found beneath him. He was saying absolutely no question of documented misconduct. The nurse acted outside her scope without authorization, and any claim to the contrary is. He saw her. He stopped walking. He finished the sentence, said something short into the phone, and ended the call. He stood 10 feet away from her in the family waiting area with patients' relatives on either side of them, and looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating an approach. You came back, he said. Checking on the patient, Nora said. The patient, Harlan said, is not your concern. You are not on staff here. You are not, as far as this hospital's records indicate, a person with any surgical qualifications whatsoever. What you are is a temp nurse who inserted herself into a sterile field without authorization, made unauthorized clinical decisions, and physically directed a board-certified attending surgeon. He came a step closer, and his voice dropped, which was worse than if he'd raised it. I've already spoken to hospital administration and to Northwest Flex. There will be a formal review. Your nursing license will be reviewed by the state board. And if I have anything to do with it, you will not set foot inside an operating room again. Nora looked at him. She said nothing for a moment, not because she didn't have a response, but because she was thinking about what Tasha had documented and what Jerome had just told her about it, and she was thinking about what Harlan had been saying on the phone when he came through those doors. That call you were just on, she said, was that administration? That is not because if you're coordinating your account with administration before the review is complete, that's going to be a problem for you when the documentation from the OR comes in. The documentation that has your exact words and timeline. She paused. I'm not a lawyer, but I've been around enough formal reviews to know what pre-coordination looks like to a board. Harlan's face did something she hadn't seen from him before. Not anger, he'd been angry, and she knew what that looked like on him. This was something less composed than anger, something that knew she was right and hated her for it. Be very careful, he said. I'm always careful, she said. It's a habit. He left without another word, which was the first time all morning she felt something that was close to relief. What she did not feel was safe. She sat in the waiting area chair for another 12 minutes, thinking. The text from the unrecognized number. We know you're in Portland. The man in the too warm jacket, who had known the building's exit routes before he'd accessed the IV port, which meant he'd had time to scout, which meant the hit on Aldrich had been planned in advance, which meant someone had known Aldrich was going to be in this hospital before Aldrich arrived in a trauma bay at midnight. You didn't know a man was going to be in a specific trauma bay at midnight, unless you caused the crash that put him there, which meant Thomas Aldrich was a target, not a victim of circumstance, which meant whatever he knew, or whatever someone believed he knew, was significant enough to stage a highway accident and then send a follow-up asset into the hospital to finish it, which meant the asset in the corridor was not acting alone. She left the waiting area and went to the main lobby, and she used the visitor's bank of public computers to access a news aggregate site and search Thomas Aldrich's name. The search returned 2 results. A brief mention in a local traffic incident report from the Oregon DOT, time-stamped at 11:04 p.m. the prior evening, and a 4-year-old profile piece from a regional business publication. She clicked the profile piece. Thomas Aldrich, long-haul carrier, owner-operator. Former logistics coordinator with a private contractor called Meridian Bridge Solutions, based in Reston, Virginia. Left the company in a dispute over billing irregularities. Currently cooperating, the article noted with careful phrasing with an ongoing federal inquiry into Meridian Bridge's contracting practices. Federal inquiry, billing irregularities. A man who left a private military contractor in a dispute. She closed the browser. She sat for a moment in the plastic lobby chair with her hands in her lap, looking at the middle distance, and she thought about the text on her phone and the number she recognized in the way that mattered, and she thought about the duffel bag in the closet that she hadn't opened in 6 weeks, and she thought about how 5 hours and 47 minutes in a hospital had just become something else entirely. She went back to the ICU waiting area. She sat in the same chair. She was still there when Dr. Kessler came through the lobby at 11:22 a.m. with a paper cup of coffee and stopped when he saw her. He came over. He did not look surprised to see her. Aldrich is improving, he said, sitting down. His pressure is holding. He's going to be extubated this afternoon, if the trend continues. Good, she said. Portland PD ran the man from the corridor. Kessler drank from the coffee. His fingerprints are in a federal database, but the file is flagged, which means they accessed it, got a name, and then got a call from somebody telling them the file was restricted, which is a specific thing that only happens in specific circumstances. Yes, Nora said. His name, Kessler said carefully, is apparently Louis Farrow, known to be connected to Meridian Bridge Solutions. He looked at her. You know what that is. I just learned, she said. Kessler was quiet for a moment. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I made a call this morning, he said, after our conversation. I have a contact, a former colleague, who went into a different kind of service. I asked him about the classified KIA record for a Major Evelyn Cross. The waiting room around them continued its ordinary life. A woman across the room, reading a magazine. An elderly man asleep in the corner chair. The ambient sound of a hospital managing its daily business. He called me back 40 minutes ago, Kessler said. Nora looked at the wall. The record exists, Kessler said. The helicopter crash, the KIA designation, all of it. But my contact said something interesting. He said the record was created, not discovered. There's a difference, apparently, in how the metadata reads to people who know how to look. He set the coffee cup down on the chair's armrest. He also said that approximately 2 weeks before the KIA designation was filed, a classified report was generated documenting that Major Cross had been present at an overseas extraction that went wrong, that she had provided medical care to a high-value intelligence asset, and that in doing so, she had observed communications and physical evidence connecting Meridian Bridge Solutions to a criminal operation the Army was already investigating separately. The woman across the room turned a page. 2 weeks later, Kessler said she was officially dead. Nora said, "That's a very specific story." "It is," Kessler said. "My contact was very specific." He looked at her profile. He was also very worried. He said that if Major Cross were alive, which the record says she isn't, and if she were to become visible, which the incident last night very much has the potential to make her, then the people who needed her dead the first. Time would have reason to finish what they started. Outside the window, the Portland morning had fully arrived. Gray sky, light rain, beginning ordinary Tuesday wait of a city going about its business. Nora said, "Who did you call, Warren?" It was the first time she'd used his name. He looked at her. "A man named General Adrian Wolfe. Retired now, but he spent 30 years in Army intelligence oversight. He said he knew Major Cross. He said she was the best trauma surgeon he'd ever seen operate under fire." Kessler paused. He said she deserved better than what happened to her. Nora's jaw was tight. She didn't trust herself to open it right away. "There are people," she said finally, very quietly, "who are going to know that last night happened. Who are going to connect what happened to Aldrich to the reason his record was flagged. Who are going to understand that whoever saved him in that OR created a witness problem that didn't exist before." "I know," Kessler said. "This hospital," she said. "The staff who were in that OR, Acker, Jerome, Tasha. They become, I know," he said again. "I've already taken steps. Security has been briefed. I've contacted the hospital's legal counsel. I've requested a federal liaison through the U.S. Attorney's Office in Portland." He looked at his hands. "I've been chief of surgery here for 9 years. I've managed a lot of things. I've never managed anything like this, but I know how to put the right pieces in place." "Steps take time," she said. Farrow wasn't working alone. "No," Kessler said. "He wasn't." He picked up the coffee cup. He looked at the ICU doors. He said quietly, "I also know that whoever you are, whatever name you're using, you came back this morning. You could have driven to Eugene and kept driving, and nobody in this hospital would have had anything on you except a signed clock-out sheet and a knot that most people wouldn't even know how to identify." He looked at her. "You came back." Nora said nothing. "That means something," he said. She looked at the ICU doors. Behind them, Thomas Aldrich was breathing on a ventilator with a repaired aorta and a blood pressure that was trending in the right direction, and a federal investigation file with his name on it and a dead man's case number connecting him to a company that had tried twice to kill him in one night. She became aware of something then, a quality in the building's ambient sound that was slightly off, a register that didn't fit the ordinary Tuesday morning. Not an alarm, not footsteps, something smaller than that. She had learned over a long time, and through circumstances she didn't revisit unnecessarily, to pay attention to the small wrongness before it became the large one. She looked at the lobby entrance. 2 men in business suits had come through the main doors and gone directly to the reception desk without stopping to look at the directory. They had the posture of people who didn't need directories because they'd already been briefed on the layout. They were speaking to the receptionist with the particular calm authority of people who carried credentials and were accustomed to those credentials producing immediate cooperation. The receptionist looked at the credentials, looked at the men, looked at her phone, and started to dial. One of the men turned his head, a slow, scanning sweep of the lobby, and his gaze passed across the waiting area and settled, for exactly 2 seconds too long, on Nora's face. She stood up. Kessler stood up beside her. "What?" "We need to move," she said. "Right now." "Who are those?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But they came in fast, and they already know the layout. And one of them just spent 2 seconds on my face, which is 1 second too many for a federal agent who's only ever seen a name on a file." She was already moving toward the corridor that ran behind the reception desk, toward the stairwell. They're not here to help, Aldrich. Kessler kept up with her without asking the question she could see forming, which elevated him significantly in her estimation. They reached the corridor door, and she pushed through it, and the sound of the lobby fell away behind them. And ahead of them was the stairwell, and the question of where they went from here. And above them on the third floor, Thomas Aldrich's monitor beeped on with its steady, hard-won rhythm. And 2 floors below them in a secure evidence bag, Louis Farrow's tampered drip bag was being collected by a lab technician who didn't yet know what she was holding. The stairwell door had just swung closed behind them when Nora's prepaid phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. A new text. Same unrecognized number. You have 1 hour to walk away. After that, we stop asking. She read the text once, put the phone back in her pocket, and kept moving. The stair was concrete and fluorescent and smelled like industrial cleaner, and her footsteps on the steps were louder than she wanted them to be. Kessler was right behind her, breathing harder than she was, but keeping up, and she gave him credit for not talking. Second floor, she said. Your office. My office isn't. It has a landline and a door that locks from the inside, and you know every person who walks past it by name, which means you'll know the moment something is wrong. She pushed through the second floor door without slowing. That's what we need right now. Kessler's office was 30 seconds down the corridor. He had the key out before they reached it, which she noted. He'd been carrying it in his hand since the lobby, which meant some part of his brain had already started preparing for needing to move fast. People surprised her occasionally. He locked the door behind them. She went to the window and stood to the side of it, angling her view down toward the main entrance without putting herself in the sight line of anyone looking up. The 2 men in suits had not come through the lobby doors yet, which meant they were either still at the reception desk, or they'd already been directed somewhere else, or they'd split up, which was the scenario she liked least. Your contact, she said. General Wolfe, can you reach him directly? I have a cell number. Call it. Tell him 2 men came into the hospital within 40 minutes of your conversation with him. Tell him you need to know if that's a coincidence. Kessler looked at her. Then he picked up his desk phone and dialed. She listened to it ring 4 times, go to voicemail, and heard Kessler leave a clipped, controlled message that contained the essential information without embellishment. He hung up. He looked at his hands for a moment. If Wolf's line is being monitored, he said. Then they already knew before he called you back, Nora said. Which means the timeline on the text I received lines up with the call, not with last night. She moved away from the window, which tells us the leak is on his end, not yours. Kessler sat down heavily in his chair. This is significantly outside my experience. You're doing fine, she said, and she meant it, and she could tell he wasn't sure whether to believe her. Do you have a direct number for the U.S. Attorney's Office? Not a general line. A person. I have a name. Sandra Vieth. She handled a malpractice case that crossed federal jurisdiction 2 years ago. We dealt with each other directly. Call her. Not from this phone. She pulled the prepaid from her pocket, held it for a moment, then set it on his desk. Not from anything they've had time to flag. Do you have a personal cell, not a hospital-issued one? Kessler reached into his inner coat pocket and produced a phone with a cracked screen in a case that had seen better years, which told her it was genuinely personal and not issued by anyone. She gave him a nod. He found the number, dialed, and got through to a human being on the third ring, which was either Luck or Vieth ran a competent office. He put it on speaker and set it on the desk between them. Warren. Vieth's voice was the voice of a woman who was already at her desk. Nora checked the clock on the wall, 11:47 in the morning, which was not surprising, but was confirming. I heard about the incident at Redwood General last night. We've been monitoring the Meridian Bridge investigation closely, and Aldrich's name is. There are 2 men in my hospital right now, Kessler said. They came in approximately 15 minutes ago. They went to reception with credentials, and I don't know who they are or what they're here for. But they came in fast and without announcement, and a person who has relevant knowledge of the situation believes they are not here in Aldrich's interest. A pause. What kind of credentials? I didn't see them directly. Where is Aldrich now? ICU 3. He's stable. He's intubated. He is not in a condition to be moved or interviewed. Another pause. Longer. Warren, I need you to get your security team to that ICU room right now. Not a single officer, the full available detail. I'm going to make 2 calls, and I will call you back in 10 minutes. She paused again. The person with relevant knowledge. Is that person still in the building? Kessler looked at Nora. Nora shook her head once. I'm not certain of their location, Kessler said. If you locate them, keep them there. They are a material witness to an active federal obstruction of justice investigation, and I would very much like to speak with them before anyone else does. The line clicked off without a goodbye, which Nora decided meant Vieth took her own timelines seriously. Kessler called his head of security, a man named Roland, who had apparently been in the building since sentencing Clarexem 6 that morning, and had already been tracking the 2 men from the lobby cameras. Roland confirmed they had presented Department of Defense contractor credentials, which was a specific category of ID that sat in a gray area between federal authority and private employment, and which reception had no clear protocol for handling. They had asked for the location of the patient from the previous night's trauma admission. Reception had told them HIPAA protocols prevented disclosure without authorization. They had said they would wait. They were currently in the main lobby seating area. They're waiting, Kessler said to Nora after he hung up. They're not waiting, she said. They're establishing a position and watching who moves. She thought about it for 30 seconds, not long, because long wasn't available. The men downstairs were contractors, not federal agents, which meant their authority in the building was essentially zero, but their instructions and their resources came from somewhere that didn't need legal authority to cause serious problems. Aldrich in the ICU was vulnerable in ways that went beyond the physical. He was sedated into baited, dependent entirely on the people around him to keep him safe. Farrow had gotten to his IV line during an 8-minute gap in direct observation. The ICU had enough staff to prevent that gap from recurring, especially with security redirected there. But security in a hospital was not trained for the kind of opposition that staged highway crashes and sent assets to finish the job in ICU rooms. She thought about the duffel bag in the closet. She thought about that for exactly 2 seconds, and then she stopped. I need to get to the ICU, she said. You don't have access. I need you to walk me up there. He stood up without arguing. She was revising her estimate of him upward again, which at this rate was going to become inconvenient. They took the stairs. She wasn't going to stand in an elevator with the lobby being watched, and came out on the 3rd floor through the door at the far end of the ICU corridor, away from the main junction. 2 of Roland's security team were already stationed outside ICU 3's door, which was Roland operating on good instinct, without being told specifically what he was dealing with. The day shift ICU charge nurse, a compact, focused woman named Patricia, who had the energy of someone running on her 3rd cup of coffee, and the disposition of someone who had kept difficult patients alive through worse, looked up when Kessler came through and said, "We have a situation." "I know," Kessler said. "What's his status?" "Pressure's at 91/62, which is the best we've seen. Respiratory compliance is improving. Dr. Acker wants to trial extubation this afternoon." Patricia's eyes moved to Nora, sitting there without any badge on her jacket, and then moved back to Kessler with the professional judgment of a woman who had seen her chief walk unusual people into unusual situations before, and had learned to read whether it was a problem or a resource. "She stays," Kessler said, simply. Patricia nodded once and returned to her workstation. Nora went to Aldrich's room. She stood in the doorway and looked at him, the rise and fall of his chest on the ventilator, the arterial line tracing on the monitor, the IV setup that had been entirely replaced with fresh lines and a new pole that the overnight team had documented in full. He was large, even supine, and diminished by the apparatus keeping him alive. And she thought about the profile piece. Logistics coordinator, owner-operator, former Meridian Bridge employee who had left in a dispute and then started cooperating with a federal inquiry. A man who had known something and had tried to do the right thing with it and had been on a highway at the wrong time because someone had decided that was easier than letting him talk. She knew what that felt like. Not the highway part. The rest of it. She went back out to the corridor. Kessler was on his personal phone, and from the focused set of his expression, he'd gotten through to someone. And she looked down the corridor toward the ICU entrance, where the double doors were closed, and she listened to the building. The wrongness, when it came from the ventilation system. It was not a sound. It was an absence, the particular absence that happened when a fire door in the HVAC plenum access was opened without the building's system, triggering the pressure compensation, which meant the access had been opened from a point that bypassed the standard sensor. She had learned that specific absence in a different kind of building in a different country. But the physics were the same. She moved to the closest wall-mounted fire seat panel and opened the cover. The plenum access diagram was printed on the inside of the cover in the standard fire code format. She read it in 4 seconds. The access closest to ICU 3 was the maintenance panel in the utility corridor that ran parallel to the ICU's north wall. She looked at the 2 security officers outside the door. "Don't let anyone in or out of that room until I come back, or doctor. Kessler tells you otherwise." The closer officer started to respond. She was already moving. The utility corridor was accessed through a door marked maintenance only that was not locked. Because hospital maintenance corridors were never locked from the corridor side, they were locked from the outside to prevent patient access, not staff access. She went through and moved along the utility side of the ICU wall in the narrow space between the HVAC ducting and the exposed electrical conduit. And she moved without a light because a light would give her position before she had a red on his. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of someone who was trying to be quiet and was 90% successful, which was good but not good enough. He was at the access panel that opened into the wall space behind Aldrich's room, and he had a tool in his hand that was not a maintenance tool. It was small and tubular, and in the ambient light from the gap under the utility door, it had the specific profile of an auto-injector, the kind that could be pressed against an IV line's secondary port through a small access gap without ever entering the room itself. Nora moved fast through the dark. She covered the 12 feet between them. In less time than he had to process the sound of her footsteps into a threat response, and she hit him from behind with her full weight behind her shoulder, driving him into the wall panel and taking the auto-injector hand and twisting it up and back in the same motion, putting his wrist into a lock that transferred all the force of any resistance directly into the joint. He made a short, sharp sound. The auto-injector hit the floor. He was bigger than Pharaoh, younger, faster, and unlike Pharaoh, he didn't need time to recalibrate. He got a hand free and drove his elbow back, and it caught her on the side of the head, which was not pleasant, and she saw the particular sparkle of impact at the edge of her vision and held the wrist lock anyway, because letting go was worse than the pain. She got a foot behind his knee and took him down. He went hard in the narrow corridor, taking both of them to the floor, and they were in the dark between 2 walls, fighting in almost complete silence, because neither of them could afford the noise, which was one of the stranger aspects of a situation she'd been in variants of before. He was trained not as well as she was, but genuinely trained, not a hired civilian, someone who had been through a program of some kind. She felt that in the way he moved, even on the floor, the way he tried to use his size as a lever rather than a hammer. She put her knee into his back in the same position she'd used on Pharaoh and got his other wrist and held both. He tested the hold twice and stopped when he understood it wasn't going to change. She was breathing hard. Her head hurt from the elbow, and she was going to have a bruise above her left ear by afternoon. She held the position anyway. "The auto-injector," she said quietly. "What's in it?" He said nothing. "It doesn't matter if you tell me," she said. "The lab will identify it in 6 hours. But if you tell me now, I can make sure the man in that room gets the right antidote before the 6 hours matters." She paused. "You were already too late. Security changed out his lines 2 hours ago. There's nowhere to deliver it anymore. So you've already failed, and the question now is just whether a man dies of your failure being covered up for 6 hours. She felt him thinking about that in the quality of his stillness. "Degoxin analog," he said. It was barely a sound, modified. "Fast onset? Concentration? I don't know the exact. Ballpark? High." She pulled out her phone and called Kessler. It rang twice. "Utility corridor, north wall. I have a second one. Call Roland and call Acker possible digoxin analog exposure. I need her to check the lines again, specifically the secondary ports on the arterial line, and I need her to have dig-specific fab fragments on standby." She looked at the man on the floor. "And I need someone down here now." She held him on the floor in the dark for 4 minutes, and 11 seconds before Roland's team came through the utility door, and then it was over, or at least that part of it was over, which was different from anything being resolved. She came back out into the ICU corridor with a bruise forming above her ear and her jacket dirty from the utility floor, and Roland's team moving the second man out in a way that was efficient and drew minimal attention from the patients and families in the adjacent rooms. Kessler was at the nursing station with Patricia and Dr. Acker, who had apparently never left the hospital or had come back or possibly lived in the building, was at Aldrich's bedside with a fresh assessment kit and the focused, zero-nonsense manner of a woman who had decided she was personally responsible for this patient's survival and was prepared to defend that position. "Lines are clear," Acker said when Nora came to the doorway. She didn't look up monitor. She didn't look up from the monitor. Whoever built that auto-injector delivery system was working on the assumption that the original port access was still viable. It wasn't. She made a note in the chart. But the analog they were using, if it had reached him in the concentration, your corridor conversation suggested, we're talking about complete AV block in 4 to 6 minutes. Not recoverable without immediate pacing. "I know," Nora said. Acker looked up then. She looked at the bruise above Nora's ear with the clinical directness of someone whose job was to assess injuries and decide what they meant. "You need ice on that later." "Now," Acker said. "Swelling on a lateral impact at the temporal region needs ice within the first 20 minutes or the inflammatory cascade." "I know what the cascade does," Nora said. Acker studied her for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I imagine you do." She reached behind the nursing station counter without taking her eyes off Nora and produced a chemical ice pack, snapped it to activate it, and held it out. Nora took it and pressed it against the side of her head, and the cold was immediately useful, even if she didn't want to admit that. Kessler was beside her now. Sandra Wyeth called back. "FBI field office in Portland is sending agents actual FBI, not DoD contractors. ETA is 22 minutes. She wants everyone who was present in the building, for both incidents on record, before the end of the day." "That's going to include Harlan," Nora said. "Yes. He's been coordinating his account." "I know. Tasha's documentation is time-stamped and stored in the hospital's legal file. Jerome confirmed his account in writing this morning at my request." Kessler's voice was steady, but she could hear what it cost him underneath the steadiness, the particular effort of a man doing something he'd never expected to have to do in his own hospital. "Harlan doesn't know that yet." She thought about Harlan's face in the waiting room. Be very careful. The call he'd been on, coordinating his account, before the review was complete. The administration conversation, the words outside conversation. Cup delivered with the confidence of a man who believed the paperwork was on his side. "When the FBI gets here," she said. I need 5 minutes before they talk to me. Kessler looked at her. For what? To make a call. Professionally. He didn't ask who to. He just nodded, and she was grateful for that because she didn't have an answer she was ready to give him. The truth was, she needed 5 minutes to decide whether to make the call at all, because making it meant acknowledging that the arithmetic had changed. Last night, the arithmetic had been simple. One man dying, one set of hands that could stop it. Now, the arithmetic involved federal investigations and DOD contractors, and an auto-injector designed for delivery through a wall, and whatever Aldrich had seen at Meridian Bridge that had made him worth two separate assassination attempts in the same 12-hour window, and the text on her phone that she had not responded to, and the bag in the closet she hadn't opened in 6 weeks. She went to the small consultation room at the end of the ICU corridor and closed the door and sat in the single chair by the window and held Kessler's cracked personal phone in her hand. She looked at the number she'd stored in her head because writing it down had never been an option. She dialed. It rang once. A man's voice, older, the particular baritone of someone who had spent decades in rooms where everything said mattered. I wondered when you'd call. General Wolfe, she said, a pause that was not surprise. Evelyn. It was the first time anyone had said that name to her in 14 months, and she hadn't anticipated what it would do to her, which was stupid. She should have anticipated it, and she hadn't. She sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with a physical impact, waiting for the system to report back. Your line was flagged, she said, after you spoke to Kessler. 2 contractors came into the hospital within 40 minutes. I know. His voice was careful. My line has been monitored since I started asking questions about the cross file 4 months ago. I should have warned Warren before I called back. 4 months, she said. You've been looking at the file for 4 months. Since Aldrich surfaced as a cooperating witness in the Meridian Bridge inquiry. His description of the extraction operation, what he'd seen, what documents he'd handled, made it clear that the person who had been present at that extraction was not actually dead. A pause. I've been trying to locate you carefully, without creating the problem that apparently happened anyway. She looked at the window. The rain was heavier now, running down the glass in the irregular patterns that rain made on surfaces it didn't quite adhere to. There was a second asset, she said, inside the hospital. Utility corridor attempting delivery through the wall behind his room. A silence that told her this was new information. Are they in custody? Yes, both of them. Another silence. Evelyn. The organization that's been running assets at Aldrich, it's not a small operation. Meridian Bridge is the civilian face. What's underneath it? Has connections that go considerably deeper than a federal contracting dispute. His voice shifted in a way she'd heard before. The gear changed from information to something that required more from the listener. They created your death record because you were present when their overseas operation was documented. Killing you was Plan A. The record was Plan B, in case killing you wasn't clean. Plan B has been sufficient for 14 months because you stayed invisible. I'm not invisible anymore, she said. No, he said. You are not. She heard the weight of it, the full weight of what the last 14 months had been, and what last night had changed, the door she'd walked through, and what it had cost her just to walk back out of it. What do they have left? She asked. After Pharaoh and the second one. I don't know exactly. Which is the problem? He paused. The FBI getting involved changes the calculus significantly. They can't run assets inside an active federal operation without compounding their exposure. But the people running this have resources, and they have lawyers, and they have time, and federal investigations are long. Another pause. You, on the other hand, are in a hospital with no badge and a bruise above your left ear and no institutional cover whatsoever. She looked at the ice pack in her hand. She almost laughed, which would have been the wrong thing to do. How do you know about the bruise? She said. I don't, Wolfe said. But in my experience, when a situation involves a utility corridor, And a second asset, someone comes out of it with a bruise, I guessed. She set the ice pack down on the windowsill. I need the file, she said. The original extraction report. The one that documents what I saw. It's in a restricted archive. Can you get it? Getting it creates a paper trail. There's already a paper trail, she said. It leads from Meridian Bridge to a drip bag in an ICU room to 2 men in custody in a Portland hospital. The paper trail exists. The paper trail exists whether there's a document in it that puts the origin on record before their lawyers start constructing the alternative version. Wolf was quiet for a long moment. She heard him breathing, which she knew meant he was at his desk and not in a car. And she knew this because she knew how he breathed in different environments, which was the kind of knowledge you accumulated about a person when you had trusted your life to their decisions. Evelyn, he said finally, if I pull that file, your name goes back into the system. Not the dead name, the real one. I know, she said. There's no going back from that. No new city, no new badge, no month-to-month apartment under a borrowed name. I know, she said again. He was quiet for another moment. Are you sure? She looked at the door of the consultation room. Through the small window in it, she could see the ICU corridor, the nursing station, the security officers at the room door, the back of Kessler's white coat where he was standing on the phone, managing the pieces he'd committed to managing. She thought about Jerome's face in the waiting room. Tasha, who had written it down. Acker, who had stayed through the morning personally and come back again and handed her an ice pack with the matter-of-fact care of someone who had decided Nora's head injury was worth 2 minutes of her attention. She thought about Thomas Aldrich, who had tried to do the right thing with what he knew and had paid for it twice in 12 hours. She thought about the extraction report and what was in it, the names, the documentation, the chain of evidence that connected Meridian Bridge's criminal operation to people who had spent 14 months trying to stay above it. She thought about what it was worth if it sat in a restricted archive while their lawyers worked the timeline. Yes, she said. Wolf said, give me 4 hours. You have 2, she said. The FBI is here in 20 minutes, and once they start the interview process, the situation becomes less flexible. 2 hours, he said, with the resignation of a man who had spent 30 years negotiating impossible timelines. Stay in the building. Don't talk to anyone you haven't already talked to. He ended the call. She sat in the chair for 60 seconds, letting the system settle. The bruise above her ear had gone past the sharp phase into the deep throb that meant it was a proper contusion, and Acker had been right about the 20-minute window, which she already knew. She pressed the ice pack back against it. She looked at the ceiling. 14 months of disappearing, and it had taken 5 hours and 47 minutes in a hospital and one man bleeding out on a table in OR 7 to undo all of it. She thought about the arithmetic. She thought about how it never really left room for the other considerations. She stood up. She came back out into the corridor, and Kessler turned when he heard the door, and she could tell from his face that something had changed in the last 4 minutes, something beyond the standard escalations of the morning. He was holding his personal phone, and his expression had the specific quality of a man who has received information that has altered his map of the situation. Harlan, he said. He's gone. She stopped. What do you mean gone? He left the building 20 minutes ago. His office says he took his coat and his personal laptop and told his assistant he had a personal emergency. Kessler's voice was controlled, but only just. Roland pulled the parking structure camera. He was met at his car by a man in a gray sedan. They spoke for approximately 2 minutes. Then Harlan got in the sedan, and they drove out. Nora stood very still in the corridor. The sedan, she said. Did Roland get a plate? Partial. Oregon registration, rental agency prefix. Kessler looked at her. Warren, who would Harlan have called, who could have sent? He stopped himself. He wasn't just obstructing, was he? He wasn't just protecting his license. She looked at the room where Thomas Aldrich breathed on a ventilator behind 2 security officers who were good men doing their jobs, but were not in any real sense equipped for what was parked outside at that door. She looked at Kessler's face at the moment when a man's understanding of the morning he'd been having shifted into something considerably larger and more dangerous than the morning he'd thought he was having. She looked at the consultation room door behind her, where she'd just committed to pulling a file that would put her name back into a system that had people in it who had already tried to kill her once. Call Vyeth, she said. Right now. Tell her Harlan left with an unknown associate, and you need the FBI timeline moved up. Moved up how much? She was already looking at the fire exit at the end of the corridor, and at the window beside it, and at the parking structure visible through the rain-streaked glass, and at the gray sedan that had not, in fact, left the parking structure that was still there, on the third level, third row, visible between the concrete pillars from this angle. And was that actually the same sedan, or was she seeing what she was primed to see? And she looked harder, and there was a man in the driver's seat who was not doing what people in parking structures do while they wait. As much as she can, Nora said. Her hand went to the phone in her pocket. The prepaid, the one that had told her she had 1 hour to walk away. That hour was 43 minutes ago. The prepaid phone was still in her hand when she made the decision. Not the decision to run. She'd stopped making that one cleanly the moment she'd pressed the elevator button back up to the ICU at 3 in the morning. The decision she made now was different and more specific. She was going to walk out of this corridor, go down to the parking structure, and sit in her car where the gray sedan could see her. And she was going to wait and see what the man in the driver's seat did when he realized she wasn't leaving. Don't come after me, she said to Kessler. That's not a reassuring thing to say. It's not meant to be reassuring. Call Vyeth, get the FBI timeline moved, and stay with Aldrich. She looked at him directly. You've done everything right this morning. Keep doing it. The people in that building, downstairs, they need the FBI and they need documentation. And they need the legal process, and you are the person who can hold all of that together. I need you here. Kessler looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who recognized he was being managed and had decided to accept it because the underlying logic was sound. What are you going to do? Find out how many more there are, she said, and give them something to look at that isn't Aldrich's room. She took the stairs down to the lobby level and came out through the ground floor maintenance exit that opened into the service lane between the hospital and the parking structure, a covered passage used for laundry carts, and equipment transfers that nobody glamorous ever used. The rain had intensified, and the passage smelled like wet concrete and exhaust from the loading dock. She moved through it and into the parking structure's ground level without passing through any entrance that a lobby camera would catch. The structure was a 6-floor concrete box with a central ramp system. She went up the ramp on foot rather than taking the elevator, staying close to the wall, and came out on the 3rd level in the northwest corner, the far end from where the sedan was parked. She stood behind a support pillar and looked. The sedan was where she'd seen it from the window. Gray, rental agency front plate, Oregon temp tag on the rear. The driver was a man in his 40s, short-cropped hair, the particular stillness of someone trained to hold a position for an extended time without fidgeting. He was watching the hospital's main entrance through the windshield with the consistency of a surveillance position, not a waiting for someone position. There was a radio unit on the console that she could see from this angle, and his left hand was resting on it. 2 things were immediately clear. He was the communication link, not the primary operator, and he was not alone in the vehicle. The passenger seat adjustment was pushed back further than the driver's, and the rear view was slightly off the mirror, angled for a taller person than the driver. Someone had been in that car recently and was now elsewhere in the structure or in the hospital. She scanned the level. 42 vehicles. 2 other people, visible a woman loading groceries into an SUV near the east exit, a man in a hospital uniform walking toward the elevator. She watched the man in the uniform. His stride was slightly too even, the kind of even that was controlled rather than natural, and he was heading for the elevator with his eyes on his phone, which was a normal thing to do, and therefore not necessarily meaningful. But she watched him until the elevator doors closed, and then she stopped watching him. She pulled the prepaid phone out. She dialed the number that had sent the texts. It rang twice, then silence, not voicemail. Someone had picked up and was not speaking. "I know you have someone in the building," she said. "And I know Harlan left in your car 20 minutes ago, which means you've already burned him as an inside resource. It's like, you're not getting him back. Because the moment he got in that sedan with a witness in a hospital looking out a window, he crossed a line that his lawyers are going to have a very difficult time walking back." She paused. "You're down to one active asset in the building, maybe two, and the FBI is 12 minutes out. Your window for anything useful closed approximately 40 minutes ago." Silence. "This call is being logged," she said. "The number, the duration, the cell charts routing through. That's already happening. I'm not telling you this to threaten you. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that the question of what I know and what I can document is no longer a question you can answer by sending someone to an ICU room." She looked at the sedan across the structure. "Call it off. Pull your people out. Because the alternative is they get picked up by the FBI inside an active federal obstruction scene, which is a different category of problem than anything you've managed so far." The silence stretched for another 4 seconds. Then the call ended. She looked at the sedan. The driver reached for his radio. 30 seconds later, the man in the hospital uniform came back out of the elevator on the 3rd level with the particular directional change of a person who had received new instructions and was recalculating his route. He went to a blue hatchback, 3 rows from the sedan, got in, and drove toward the exit ramp without looking around. The sedan followed 90 seconds later. She watched both vehicles leave the structure and turn onto the street below. She stood in the parking structure for another minute, making sure, and then she went back down and through the service passage and up the stairs to the ICU corridor. Her hands were steady. The bruise above her ear was a sustained deep ache that she was managing by not thinking about it, which was sustainable for approximately another 4 hours. Kessler was off the phone when she came back through. "FBI is 8 minutes out." Vieth accelerated the timeline. He looked at her. The sedan left. "Both vehicles," she said. "They pulled back." "Why?" "Because someone made a calculation and decided the exposure wasn't worth it anymore. At least not through direct action." She sat down in the chair at the nursing station and because her legs had been moving for the better part of 7 hours, and they were registering an opinion about that. Which means the next phase is legal. Lawyers and document management and alternative narratives. Which is actually worse, in some ways because it takes longer and it's harder to see coming. But it means Aldrich is physically safer than he was 20 minutes ago. Patricia, at the nursing station, did not look up from her charting, but she also didn't pretend she hadn't heard, which Nora appreciated. Patricia had the quality of a person who understood that information was a clinical resource and treated it accordingly. "His pressure is at 94, Patricia said to her screen. "He's been stable for the last 32 minutes. "Good," Nora said. The FBI agents arrived at 12:21 p. M, 2 of them, a man named Okafor and a woman named Delisle, both from the Portland field office, and both carrying the specific energy of agents who had been briefed on something unusual and were recalibrating their approach in real time as they moved through the hospital. Okafor was the lead. He had the kind of face that was designed to appear neutral and mostly succeeded. Delisle was taking notes before anyone had said anything significant, which told Norris she was the one who would actually retain everything. They set up in the conference room that Kessler's assistant had cleared. And they started with Kessler, which was the correct sequence. Establish the institutional timeline first, then work inward. Nora sat in the ICU waiting area outside the conference room and waited, which was not her natural mode, but was what the situation required. Jerome came and sat near her after a while, not saying anything, just present in the way that some people could be present without making it a demand. She found it tolerable, which was about as much as she could say for company right now. She was thinking about Harlan, not with anger. Anger was a resource she didn't have to spare at the moment, but with the particular attention she gave to problems that had more dimensions than they appeared to. Harlan had left the building with a man from the gray sedan, which established a connection that was going to be documented and pursued. But the connection itself raised questions she hadn't fully mapped yet. Harlan was a surgeon with 26 years of vascular trauma practice. He was arrogant, territorially aggressive, willing to let a patient die rather than accept help from a source he found beneath him. Those qualities were self-contained and needed no external connection to explain them. The question was whether the external connection had been there, first whether Harlan had been placed at Redwood General by design, or whether he'd simply been recruited after the fact by people who understood how to use a man's ambitions and grievances as a lever. If it was the latter, the connection was probably recent and thin, and would fall apart under FBI pressure. If it was the former, the implications were considerably more complicated, and the paper trail considerably longer. She was still thinking about this when Delisle opened the conference room door and looked at her. "We're ready for you," she went in. Okafor was seated at the end of the table with a yellow legal pad and a recorded device that he noted was recording. Delisle sat to the side. There was a bottle of water on the table in front of the chair they were clearly expecting her to take, which was either consideration or a standard interview protocol signal, and was possibly both. "Ms. Voss," Okafor began. "Before we start," she said, "I need to tell you something." Okafor looked at her. Okay. "My name is not Nora Voss." She sat down. She could put her hands flat on the table, which was not a gesture she was entirely comfortable with, but seemed like the appropriate one. "My name is Evelyn Cross. I hold a rank of major in the United States Army, currently listed as inactive, following a classified KIA designation that was created administratively rather than as a result of actual death." She paused. "General Adrian Wolf of Army Intelligence Oversight is in the process of pulling the original extraction report that documents my presence at the event that led to the designation. He is working on a 2-hour timeline that started approximately 45 minutes ago." The room was quiet. Delisle's pen had stopped moving. Then it started again, faster. Okafor looked at her with the expression of a man who had been briefed on something unusual and had just received confirmation that the briefing had significantly undersold it. "Major Cross," he said, making the adjustment without visible strain, which elevated him in her estimation. "We were informed by AUSA Vieth that there might be a military intelligence dimension to this situation." "There is," she said. "I'm going to tell you everything. I need 2 things in return. I'm listening. 1. Thomas Aldrich stays in this hospital under federal protection until he can be moved to a secure facility. Not hospital security, federal protection. The people who ran assets at him twice in the last 12 hours have resources that hospital security is not equipped to manage. Agreed in principle. We'll need authorization from. That's your problem, not mine," she said. 2. The documentation from this hospital, the OR records, the ICU logs, the staffing documentation, everything from last night and this morning is preserved under federal evidence protection before Harlan's legal team can request access. Because they will request access, and they will do it fast. Okafor and Delisle exchanged a look that was brief and communicative. "We can initiate an evidence preservation order," Delisle said. "That would require however long it takes," Nora said. "Make it fast." Then she talked for 47 minutes. She told them about the extraction, the overseas operation, the documents she'd seen, the identities she'd been able to verify at the scene, the chain of evidence she'd carried in her memory for 14 months because writing it down had never been safe. She told them about the KIA designation and the 14 months of disappearing, the sequence of cities and borrowed names and month-to-month leases. She told them about the text messages and the 2 assets and what she'd found in the utility corridor. And she told them about Harlan and the phone call she'd interrupted in the room and what she believed this sedan connection meant. She told it in chronological order, in the flat, precise register she used for mission debriefs. And when she was done, she drank the entire bottle of water in the silence that followed. Okafor looked at his legal pad for a moment. Major cross. The documents you describe, the ones you observed during the extraction. Do you have any physical record? No. I have what I can recall, which is detailed. I was trained to observe and retain operational information in field conditions. She paused. Wolf's extraction report will corroborate the core elements. The rest will have to come from the Meridian Bridge inquiry itself, Aldrich's testimony, the internal documents he's already provided. His testimony is going to be substantially stronger if you can corroborate the operational context. I know. Which means you're going to need to be available, Okafor said, for an extended period. Not a conversation, a formal process. I know that too, she said. It was a different arithmetic from last night's, but it was still arithmetic, and it still didn't leave much room for the other considerations. Okafor closed his legal pad. I want to say something off the record. She nodded. What you did in that OR last night, and in the ICU, and in the corridor, and in the utility space this morning, you did it without any institutional cover, without any authority, without any protection. And you stayed. He paused. That's going to matter. When this goes to formal proceedings, and it will, the fact that you stayed is going to be on the record, and it's going to be documented by every person in this hospital who saw it. She didn't say anything to that. She was not sure what to say to it. We're done for now, he said. Please don't leave the building. She went back to the ICU corridor. The afternoon had settled into the particular rhythm of a hospital, managing a complicated day's staff, moving with purpose, the ambient sound of a place that was doing its job. She sat in the waiting area chair, and Kessler came and sat across from her, and they were quiet for a moment. How did it go? He said. Fine, she said. They're good. Vieth called while you were in there. The evidence preservation order is in process. He paused. Harlan's attorney contacted the hospital at 1:15. They're claiming he left due to personal distress related to the events of last night, and that he'll be available for interview at a time of his choosing. She almost smiled. His attorney contacted the hospital before contacting the FBI? Apparently. That's a mistake, she said. His lawyer doesn't know yet what the FBI has. If he'd waited 12 hours, he'd have a better sense of what account to construct. She looked at the ICU doors. It means he panicked, which means the connection to the sedan is more recent than I thought, and he's not sure how much they've already given up. Kessler was quiet for a moment. Will he lose his license? She thought about that. About the retractor held at exactly the angle she'd placed his hand, about the voice that had said outside her scope, with the full confidence of a man who believed the institution was behind him. About a patient at 34 systolic while the surgeon, who was supposed to save him, declared the situation unmanageable. That's going to depend on what the board review turns up, she said. But yes, the OR documentation, the phone call you interrupted, the sedan. Yes. At 3:47 p.m., Wolf called Kessler's personal phone, because it was the number Nora had called him from. She took the phone from Kessler in the corridor and listened. The report is pulled, Wolf said. It's been submitted to the U.S. Army Inspector General's office with a request for immediate transfer to the FBI's Portland field office. The IG has been briefed on the KIA designation's discrepancy. There will be a formal review of how the designation was created and who authorized it. She let that settle. Timeline? The report reaches Okafor's desk by 5 p.m. today. The IG review will take longer weeks, possibly months. But the core documentation is out of the restricted archive and into a federal evidence chain, which means it cannot be suppressed. A pause. Evelyn. There are names in that report. Senior names. People who authorized the designation and who have, in the intervening 14 months, continued to provide institutional cover for Meridian Bridge's operations. I know, she said. When those names become public, and they will become public, because this is now an IG matter, and those tend toward disclosure, there will be a period of significant pressure. On Aldrich, on the investigation, and on you. I understand. You have people in that hospital who have put themselves on record supporting you. That's not nothing. He paused. It's actually quite a lot. She looked through the ICU window at Aldrich's room. Patricia checking his monitor with the same focused efficiency she'd brought to the job all morning. She looked at the nursing station, where Jerome was talking to a day shift scrub tech she didn't know, using his hands the way he used them when he was explaining something that had happened, and the tech's face was the face of someone hearing something they were going to be thinking about for a long time. She looked at the conference room door, behind which Okafor and Delisle were doing the work of converting 14 months of careful disappearing into something the law could use. I know it's not nothing, she said. She handed the phone back to Kessler. He looked at her. Is it done? The first part, she said. At 4:22 p.m., Thomas Aldrich was successfully extubated. Dr. Acker managed the process herself, which surprised no one who had been paying attention to the morning. His oxygen saturation held at 96% on 2 liters of nasal cannula, and his first coherent statement, delivered in the ragged voice of a man who had been intubated for 13 hours and had survived 2 attempts on his life, and a posterior aortic tear, was directed at the nurse adjusting his nasal cannula. He said, "Did they get the driver?" Patricia said, "Rest." He said, "The truck, the one that hit me. It wasn't an accident." "We know," Patricia said, "Rest." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is there a woman?" "Someone was here. I could hear a voice in the room when I was coming up from the anesthesia." A woman's voice telling someone to check the lines. Patricia looked at the doorway, where Nora was standing just outside the frame of the window. "Rest," Patricia said again. "You can ask your questions tomorrow." Nora stepped back from the window and leaned against the corridor wall and closed her eyes for 30 seconds. Her head throbbed. The bruise had hit the full development phase, and her vision was perfectly clear, which meant it was soft tissue and not structural, which she'd assessed correctly 6 hours ago and was glad to have confirmed. She was tired in the particular way of someone who had been operating at high intensity for 17 hours on no sleep and was now beginning to experience the body's invoice for that. She was still leaning against the wall when Okafor came out of the conference room and stopped when he saw her. "The preservation order is confirmed," he said. "All hospital records from last night and this morning are in federal evidence chain as of 4:15. He paused. "We've also identified the gray sedan. It was rented under a corporate account connected to a shell company with documented ties to Meridian Bridge. The renter's name," he glanced at his notepad, "is David Harlan." She opened her eyes. "David, Garrett Harlan's brother, currently employed as a logistics manager at a subsidiary company that we're looking at in connection with 3 other federal matters." He put the notepad away. Garrett Harlan didn't get recruited after the fact. He was already inside the arrangement. Has been for at least 2 years, based on the corporate records. She absorbed that. The arrogance in the OR that had looked like ego was something more deliberate than ego. The certainty that his account would hold was the certainty of a man who believed the institution protecting him extended considerably beyond hospital administration. He had let Aldrich die on the table, not because he was having a bad night and not because his skills were inadequate, but because a dead Aldrich was preferable to a surviving one. The arithmetic of that, the cold, clean arithmetic of it, made her hands go still at her sides. "Where is he now?" she said. "We have a location." He's been taken in for questioning as of 30 minutes ago. The attorney who contacted your hospital is currently at the federal building, trying to figure out which of his client's problems to address first. Okafor paused. We're going to need your formal statement on the OR sequence. What you observed regarding Harlan's conduct. The timeline, his words, his actions. I'll give you everything, she said. I know. He looked at her, a different quality of looking than the interview, something that wasn't quite personal, but wasn't fully professional either. Major Cross, before we continue, is there anything you need right now? Not from the investigation. From the building. She thought about it for a genuine moment. Coffee, she said, if there's any left. Okafor almost smiled. I'll see what we can do. The coffee that materialized 20 minutes later was from the surgical staff or break room and was approximately 4 hours old, which made it exactly the right temperature for drinking without waiting, and exactly the wrong temperature for tasting. She drank it standing in the corridor outside the ICU, watching the afternoon shift change happen around her, the particular organized handover of a hospital moving from one phase of its day to the next. Jerome came by at 5:15 with his street clothes on and his bag over his shoulder. He stopped in front of her. Going home? She said. 15 hours ago I was supposed to go home, he said. Then some things happened. He looked at her with the same direct quality he'd brought to every interaction they'd had, which she'd decided was simply how Jerome was built. They're saying the FBI is involved now, that the man in Aldrich's room, the crash, all of it was connected to something bigger. Yes, she said. And you knew that last night in the ICU. When you looked at the drip bag, you weren't just seeing a tampered line. You already knew the shape of it. She held the coffee cup. Some of it. Jerome nodded slowly. He shifted his bag on his shoulder. I told the FBI agent Delisle everything I remember from the OR. The exact sequence. What Harlan said, what you said, the timestamps, as best I could reconstruct them. He paused. I want you to know that. Jerome, I also want you to know, he said, that when you handed me that suture order last night, the Pledget, the 4-0 Proline, I've been turning that over in my head all day. Why I moved. Why I handed it to you, instead of waiting for Harlan's direction. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't even a decision, really. It was just you knew, and knowing has a sound to it that's different from everything else. He paused. I've heard a lot of surgeons in a lot of rooms. I've never heard anything sound like that. She didn't know what to do with that, so she said, Go home, Jerome. Sleep. Yeah, he said. He started to walk away. Then he stopped. They're going to figure out who you really are, aren't they? They already have, she said. He nodded once, like that confirmed something he'd been carrying all day, and then he left. The corridor settled back into its late afternoon rhythm. Through the ICU window, Aldrich was awake, looking at the ceiling, alive in the provisional and hard-won way of people who have survived things they weren't supposed to survive. The federal protection detail that Okafor had arranged had materialized by 3 o'clock, 2 agents, not hospital security, stationed at the room with the specific posture of people who were not going to be managed by a fake maintenance uniform. At 5:40, Kessler found her still in the corridor and said, There's something you should know. She looked at him. Harlan's attorney, he said, just filed a preemptive complaint with the state medical board, naming you, alleging unauthorized practice of medicine, interference with a licensed physician, assault on a surgical attending. He paused. It's procedurally aggressive and almost certainly going to fail given the federal evidence chain, but it's going to be on the record. Your name, your actions. He looked at her steadily. Your real name, as of the filing they've used, the Nora Voss identification. They don't have my real name yet, she said. No, he said. But they will, when the IG report goes public. He paused. I want you to be prepared for that. She was quiet for a moment. The coffee cup was empty. She'd been holding it for the last 20 minutes, more out of habit than anything else. She set it down on the windowsill, and looked at the ICU doors. Kessler, she said. Warren. Warren. She said it this time, in full. When the report goes public, there's going to be a period where my name is attached to a complaint and a KJ designation and a classified operation and a federal investigation, simultaneously in the public record. That's going to look complicated from the outside. Yes, he said. And the complaint is going to allege that I practiced medicine without authorization, which is technically accurate in the sense that my Army credentials are listed as inactive, and my employment at this hospital was as a registered nurse. Also technically accurate, he said. I need you to understand, she said carefully, that I am aware of all of that. And I am choosing to be on the record anyway. Kessler was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window. He looked at her profile. I documented the repair, he said. When I came into the observation gallery last Nasdaq's night and saw what had been done, I documented it in my personal notes before I came downstairs. The technique, the result, the patient's vitals, before and after. I also documented it in my formal incident report this morning. He paused. A complaint to the medical board about unauthorized practice is going to have a significant amount of documentation to reckon with. On both sides, she turned to look at him. The board review, he said, typically takes 4 to 6 months. In cases involving federal investigations, timelines compress. I've been chief of surgery here for 9 years. I've sat on the Oregon Medical Board's advisory committee for 3 of those years. He held her gaze. I intend to submit a formal statement, not as your advocate, but as a witness. The distinction matters. He paused. But I want you to know I intend to do it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then something happened in her face that she hadn't planned, not a smile exactly, not the obvious version of relief, but a loosening of something that had been held too long, the way a suture releases tension incrementally when the knot is finally tied properly and the tissue can start to do the work of healing. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. The board is still the board. At 6:03 p.m., Okafor came out of the conference room with his phone in his hand and the expression of a man who has just received information that has changed the geography of his afternoon. Major Cross, he said. She straightened. We've been going through the shell company records connected to the sedan rental. One of the subsidiary accounts has transactions going back 3 years. He paused, including a series of payments to an account we've been able to link through 2 intermediaries to a current employee of Redwood General Hospital. Not Harlan. Harlan was already in federal custody. She ran through the roster, in her head, the people who had been in and around the case, the people who had known enough, the people who had had access. Who? She said. Okafor looked at his phone, then at her. The staffing coordinator who processed your badge last night, he said. Her name is Delia Marsh. The name landed like a pressure change, sudden, systemic, the kind that made you aware of your own breathing. Delia Marsh, 22 years on the floor. The woman who had processed her badge, the woman who had processed her badge and told her not to speak unless spoken to and handed her a locker assignment without a second glance. The woman who had known she was coming before she arrived. She placed you in OR 7, Okafor said. The one case. The one patient. The one night. His voice was flat and deliberate. She knew who you were. Nora stood very still. If Delia had known, if the placement had been deliberate, then the question was not how the contractors had found her in Portland. The question was whether she had ever been hidden at all, or whether the last 6 weeks in the month-to-month apartment with the cash-paid car and the borrowed name had been a corridor someone had built specifically to walk her down. She looked at the ICU doors. She looked at the federal protection detail outside Aldrich's room. She looked at Kessler's face, where the same calculation was beginning to run. Where is she now? Nora said. Her shift ended at 3 p.m., Okafor said. She clocked out at 3:12. We have a unit going to her home address. He paused. But her personal phone went dark at 3:18. 6 minutes. 6 minutes between clocking out and going dark, which was either panic or protocol, and both of those answers led to the same place someone had told her. The FBI was in the building, and she had exactly what to do when that happened, which meant she had not acted alone, which meant the question of how many more there were was still open. 6 minutes between clocking out and going dark was enough time to reach a car. Enough time to make one call. Enough time to decide that whatever loyalty or payment had kept Delia Marsh in position, for however long she'd been in position, was not worth what was walking through the hospital's front doors. Nora looked at Okafor. "She's not running," she said. "Someone told her to move, and she moved. That's protocol, not panic. There's a difference." "What's the difference matter right now?" "It matters, because panic goes somewhere random, and protocol goes somewhere specific. She has a destination." Nora looked at the hallway, then back at him. "Who else knew I was being placed here last night? Who does the staffing coordinator report to? And who does that person have contact with outside the hospital?" Okafor was already on his phone, moving back toward the conference room. Delisle fell in beside him, and they were talking in the low, rapid register of people working a problem in real time. And Nora stayed in the corridor, because the corridor was where she could see the ICU doors and the protection detail, and all the things she needed to keep in her sightline. Kessler stood beside her. He didn't say anything, which was the right call. She thought about Delia Marsh. 22 years on the floor. 4 of them in this trauma wing. A woman who had processed 200 agency nurses and knew within 45 seconds which ones were useful. Who had looked at Nora's badge and locker assignment and told her exactly where to stand and exactly what not to do, with the confidence of someone who knew precisely what was going to happen in Ort 7 that night and needed Nora positioned for it. The placement had not been accidental. None of it had been accidental. Which meant the crash on I-84 had been the opening move, not the whole plan. Aldrich was the stated target, but Aldrich dying cleanly in an oar would not have produced the specific outcome that someone had wanted. They had needed Nora in that room. They had needed her to surface to do exactly what she had done, which was walk forward and take over a sterile field and demonstrate in front of a surgical team that she was not what her badge said she was. The KIA designation protected Meridian Bridge as long as the one witness who could corroborate Aldrich's account remained officially dead. Surfacing her in a public incident, one that would be documented, witnessed, and formally reviewed, gave them something the designation no longer provided: a living target with a documented location and a legal identity crisis that could be weaponized. The plan had been to flush her out and finish it cleanly before the documentation became too substantial to manage. What the plan had not accounted for was Jerome handing her the suture in 8 seconds, or Tasha writing it all down, or Kessler standing in the observation gallery recognizing a knot he'd spent 8 years thinking about, or Patricia keeping ice packs available at the nursing station, or any of the ordinary human decisions that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. Plans rarely accounted for that kind of thing. In her experience, that was the only real advantage the outnumbered ever had. Okafor came back out of the conference room at 6:31 with the controlled momentum of a man who had just received exactly the information he needed and was now deploying it. Delia Marsh was located at 6:27. She was at a storage facility in Beaverton, a unit rented under a name that connects to the same shell company network as the sedan rental. She's in custody. She has not requested an attorney yet, which means she doesn't know we already have the financial records, which means the next 20 minutes of her interview are going to be very productive. "What was in the unit?" Nora asked. "Documents, communications, a laptop." He paused. "And a personnel file on a Major Evelyn Cross, U.S. Army, with photographs and location history going back 11 months. 11 months. She had thought she had been invisible for 14. She had been visible 11 of them. She had been visible for 11 of them, watched from a careful distance by people who were waiting for the right moment to use what they knew. She processed that. It took approximately 4 seconds, and it was not pleasant, and then she was done with it. Because the arithmetic of what it changed was 0. The documents were in federal custody. Marsh was in custody. And the location history they'd been building for 11 months had just become evidence in their own prosecution. The careful watching had worked exactly as well for them as it had for her, which was to say not quite well enough when the moment arrived. "I need to make a statement," she said to Okafor. "A full formal statement. Everything, the extraction, the designation, the 14 months, Marsh, the OR, the ICU, the utility corridor, all of it. I want it on record before their attorneys start constructing the alternative." "We're ready when you are," he said. "Now," she said. "I'm ready now." She was in the conference room for 2 hours and 14 minutes. She talked, and Delisle wrote, and Okafor asked the clarifying questions of someone who understood what he was building and needed the architecture to hold under pressure. She was not a perfect witness. She had gaps in the timeline. A few names she couldn't confirm with certainty. One sequence of events she had to caveat because her memory of it was auditory rather than visual. She noted every caveat explicitly because a compromised detail that she'd flagged herself was evidence, and a compromised detail that opposing counsel found was a problem. She had learned that distinction in a setting where the cost of getting it wrong was considerably higher than a courtroom. When it was done, Okafor looked at his notes for a long moment. "Major Cross," he said, "what you've given us tonight, combined with Aldrich's testimony and the documents from Marsh's storage unit, this is a substantial case. Not a perfect case, but substantial." "Cases are never perfect," she said. "People aren't perfect. You work with what's accurate and you build from there." He nodded. He looked like a man who had been doing this long enough to know that was true and short enough to still find it occasionally frustrating. "The U.S. Attorney's Office is going to be in contact. There will be a formal deposition process. It's going to take time. I know. And your situation, the KIA designation, the identity documentation, the IG review, is going to run parallel to the criminal proceedings. That's going to mean a period where your legal status is, technically speaking, complicated." "How complicated?" she said. "You are currently simultaneously a deceased Army officer, an active federal witness, and a person against whom a medical board complaint has been filed." He paused. "So, fairly complicated." She looked at the table. She looked at her hands on the table. "What do you need from me in the immediate term? Stay in Portland. Stay reachable. Don't disappear." She almost laughed at that one. After 14 months of disappearing being the entire strategy, being told not to do it felt like being told not to breathe. "I'll stay," she said. She came out of the conference room at 8:47 p.m. The ICU corridor was quieter now, the end of the evening shift, the building settling into its nighttime register. The protection detail was still outside Aldrich's room. Patricia had been replaced by the night charge nurse, a man named Ellis, who had clearly been briefed because he gave Nora the specific nod of someone who has been told who a person is and has decided that person is allowed to be there. Kessler was still in the building. She had stopped being surprised by this. He was in his office with the door open and a cup of something that was not coffee based on the smell, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "Done?" he said. "For tonight," she said. He looked at her face for a moment with the clinical attention of a surgeon, assessing a patient's reserve. "When did you last sleep?" "Yesterday," she said. "Technically." "Sit down." She sat in the visitor's chair. The office was quieter than it had been this morning. The granola bar was gone. From the monitor, the phone had been returned to its cradle. The stacked journals were slightly more disordered from being consulted and replaced. The photo on the shelf was still turned away from the visitor's chair. She had decided, during the course of the day, not to ask about it. "The board complaint," he said. "Harlan's attorney filed it under your agency name. When the IG report goes public and your actual name comes into the record, they'll need to refile or amend. That process will take time. In the interim, Your nursing license under Nora Voss is technically under review, but there's no enforcement action, and given the federal proceedings, the board is going to move very carefully. You've been busy, she said. I've been on the phone, he said, which is most of what being chief of surgery actually involves, despite what the job title implies. He paused. I also filed my witness statement with the board this afternoon. Formally, as a witness to the OR events, not as your advocate. The distinction has, as I mentioned, matters procedurally. You mentioned? She said. I remember. He was quiet for a moment, turning the cup in his hands. What are you going to do after all of this? When the proceedings are done, and your name is back in the record and the designation is corrected. She had been thinking about that in the margins of the day, between the conference room and the corridor and the conversation with Wolf and the coffee that had been 4 hours old. She had been thinking about it in the way you think about things that have been foreclosed for so long that imagining them open again requires a deliberate effort. I don't know exactly, she said. That's the honest answer. Fair, he said. I know I'm not going back to month-to-month leases and borrowed names, she said. That's done. Not because it failed, it worked for 14 months, but because she paused. She was trying to find the precise language for something that hadn't needed to be precise before, because hiding it cost more than I thought it did. Not just personally, actually cost. Aldrich almost died, because the person who could identify what was happening to him was in the parking garage looking at her car. Kessler looked at her steadily. You came back, though. Eventually, she said. That's the problem with eventually. He was quiet for a moment. Then I want to say something that may be premature and is certainly presumptuous. Go ahead. This hospital has a trauma program that is very good in several respects and genuinely inadequate in one specific area, which is complex penetrating thoracic trauma with vascular involvement. He said it with the directness of a man presenting a clinical problem. We lose patients that we shouldn't lose. Not because the team isn't skilled, they are, but because the skill set required for that specific injury profile is not something that develops in civilian trauma practice. It develops in field conditions, in exactly the kind of conditions that apparently produced the technique you used last night. He paused. When your legal situation stabilizes, when the designation is corrected and your credentials are back in the system. I would like to talk to you about what a formal position here might look like. The office was very quiet. She looked at him for a long moment. You're offering me a job. I'm offering to have a conversation about a job, he said, when the time is right, which it isn't yet. But I wanted you to know the conversation is available. She looked at the window. Portland at night, the rain still moving. The city lights diffused through it. The parking structure across the way now empty of gray sedans and men watching the hospital entrance. An ordinary night from the outside. The kind of night that didn't know what had happened inside the building. It was wrapping around. She thought about the OR at 2:17 in the morning. The monitor screaming, the blood pooling, the room going still. The moment she had set down the basin and walked forward. She had told herself it was arithmetic. She had told herself it was the only calculation available. But she had been lying to herself in the specific way she'd gotten very good at over 14 months, and she knew it now in the way you know things when the day has been long enough to strip the comfort off them. She had walked forward because she could not walk forward. Because the thing she was, whatever name it operated under, did not stop being the thing it was just because she needed it to. And hiding it had not made it smaller or safer, or more manageable. It had just made it unavailable. And unavailable was its own kind of cost. When the time is right, she said. Kessler nodded. He did not push. She was grateful. She left the hospital at 9:23 p.m. and drove back to the apartment through the rain. And she went to the closet and moved the hanging clothes aside and looked at the olive green duffel on the floor. She looked at it for a long time. Then she unzipped it. Inside, her Army ID in her actual name. Her medical credentials under the same name, laminated slightly worn at the corners. A folded set of orders that had never been formally rescinded, because the system that would have rescinded them had instead issued a death record and considered the matter closed. A photograph of a surgical team, 5 people in ore greens, somewhere overseas, somewhere dusty and hot, that she didn't miss, but didn't entirely not miss either. A small notebook in her own handwriting, clinical observation from field cases that had never made it into any formal record, because there had been no formal record to put them in. She took out the ID. She held it. Major Evelyn Cross, United States Army. The photograph was 4 years old, and she looked younger in it, or maybe just less weathered, or maybe just like a person who didn't yet know what the next 4 years were going to cost. She set it on the nightstand next to the prepaid phone that had told her she had 1 hour to walk away, and that she had not listened to, which was, on balance, the correct decision. She slept for 9 hours without moving. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple or linear, because nothing involving federal investigations and IG reviews and medical board proceedings ever was. There were depositions and interviews and document requests and 3 separate conversations with attorneys, one assigned through the Army's JAG office. Once the IG review formally acknowledged that she was alive, one from the U.S. Attorney's office, and one that Kessler arranged through the hospital's legal counsel, which she accepted because Kessler had earned the right to arrange things on her behalf, and she was learning, slowly, to let people who had earned things have them. Delia Marsh cooperated. She did it within 72 hours of her arrest, which was faster than Nora had expected, and told her that Marsh's position in the arrangement had been more transactional than ideological. She had been paid for access and information, and when the payment stopped being worth the risk, the loyalty stopped with it. Her cooperation produced names, account numbers, communication records, and a timeline of Meridian Bridge's domestic operations that gave the federal case a backbone it had previously been building slowly from the outside. Louis Farrow and the second asset, whose name was confirmed as Ray Sutter, former private security contractor, were charged federally with attempted murder, conspiracy, and obstruction. Their attorney argued that they had been acting under contractual instructions from Meridian Bridge and were therefore entitled to certain protections that the attorney's own filing made clear he understood were not actually going to hold. They did not hold. Garrett Harlan was charged with obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit murder, and willful endangerment of a patient. The medical board proceeding ran parallel to the criminal case and moved faster than Okafor had predicted, partly because Tasha's documentation was airtight, and partly because Jerome's formal statement was the kind of first-hand account that left very little interpretive room. The board suspended his license within 60 days, pending the criminal outcome. At trial, his attorney argued that Harlan had acted under duress and without full understanding of what he was involved in, which the jury considered for 2 days and did not accept. He was convicted on all counts. He was not a surgeon anymore. The IG review concluded 4 months after it opened, which was fast by the standards of IG reviews, and which Wolf attributed to the fact that the underlying documentation was strong and the people whose names appeared in it had, in several cases, already begun the process of lawyering up in ways that tended to confirm the review's direction. The KIA designation for Major Evelyn Cross was formally rescinded. The record was corrected. The correction was not announced publicly with any ceremony, because IG corrections rarely were, but it was filed and logged and entered into the system in the way that official things were, and it was permanent. Her name came back into the world quietly, on a Tuesday, in a document that most people would never read. She read it twice. Then she put it in the folder with the other documents, and made herself a cup of coffee, and stood at the window of the apartment she had rented properly, this time, under her actual name, in a building where the manager worked days, and had asked her on the first meeting what she did for work. And she had said she was in medicine, which was the first fully true answer she'd given to that question in 14 months. Aldrich testified at the Meridian Bridge trial, 6 months after the night on I-84. He walked into the federal courthouse in Portland on his own legs, which he had been doing since approximately 6 weeks post-discharge, and he testified for 2 days about what he had seen and handled and documented during his time at Meridian Bridge. And his testimony was corroborated at every significant junction by the documentary record that Marsh's cooperation had provided. He was a careful, specific witness, not dramatic, not emotional, just accurate in the way of a man who had decided that accuracy was the only version of this he was going to be able to live with. The jury was in deliberation for less than a day. Evelyn was in the courthouse hallway when he came out after the verdict. She had not planned to be there. She had told herself she was in the building for a separate meeting with Delisle, which was technically true, and also not the whole reason. He saw her across the hallway and stopped. He was larger than she'd expected, or maybe she'd constructed him differently, from the image of a man supine and diminished by apparatus. He had the look of someone who had been through something significant and had not entirely finished being surprised by his own survival. He said, "You're the one who was in the OR." "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment, not with the expression she'd expected, which would have been some version of gratitude, but with something more complicated than that. The expression of a man who had thought about something for 6 months and was now trying to figure out if the reality matched the thinking. "I heard your voice," he said, "when I was coming up from the anesthesia, telling someone to check the lines." "Yes," she said again. He nodded slowly. "I spent 32 years doing a job," he said. "Moving cargo, managing logistics. Mostly just trying to do the thing in front of me competently. And then I saw what I saw at Meridian Bridge, and I thought there's a thing in front of me. The thing is wrong. I have to say so." He looked at the courthouse floor. "I didn't think it was going to cost what it cost." "It usually costs more than you think," she said. "Yeah." He looked back up at her. "Was it the same for you? The thing in front of you?" She thought about the basin she'd set down. The monitor screaming. The room going still and herself walking forward into the stillness. The arithmetic that never left room for the other considerations, until the moment when the other considerations turned out to be the thing that mattered most. "Yes," she said. "It was exactly the same." He nodded like that settled something. They shook hands, which felt slightly formal for what the context was, and he went down the hallway toward his family, a woman and 2 adult children who had been waiting by the elevator, with the specific posture of people who had been through a long thing and were ready for it to be over, and she watched him go. The conversation with Kessler happened on a Thursday in October, which was the right time for it. The IG review was concluded. Her credentials were restored under her actual name, and the medical board had formally dismissed the complaint filed under the Nora Voss identification, on the grounds that the complainant, Harlan, through his attorney, lacked standing, given the criminal conviction. The dismissal had been worded carefully and said nothing that was not procedurally necessary, but it was in the record, and the complaint was not. Kessler's office looked the same as it had the first time she'd sat in it, except that the granola bar position on the monitor rotated apparently because there was a different one today, and the photo on the shelf had been moved slightly, not turned toward the visitor's chair, but less turned away from it. She noticed but didn't comment. "The position," he said. "I want to be honest with you about what it involves and what it doesn't." "Go ahead," she said. "It is not a surgical attending position. The hospital's credentialing process for surgical privileges takes time and involves a formal review that your convolves will need to go through, that your credentials will need to go through regardless of what I know about your capabilities. I can't shortcut that, and I wouldn't if I could." He was direct about it, which she appreciated. "What I can offer immediately is a senior trauma clinical specialist role. It carries real authority in the trauma bay, real input into protocols, and real scope for the specific skill development that I told you this program lacks. It is not everything you were trained for, but It is beginning that is honest about what it is. She looked at the window. The October light in Portland was the low amber of a city that knew winter was coming and was making peace with it. I spent 14 months being invisible, she said. I was very good at it, and I was very bad at it in the ways that mattered. She paused. I don't want to be a clinical specialist indefinitely. I want the surgical privileges. I'm willing to go through the credentialing process because the process exists for reasons that are sound even when they're inconvenient. I know, he said. And I want it documented, she said. All of it. My name, my credentials, my history. Not managed or softened. Documented. That was never in question, he said. She looked at him. Then yes, she said. I'll take the position. He extended his hand across the desk. She shook it. It was not a triumphant moment. It was a Tuesday moment, ordinary and imperfect and real, in the way that things are real when they've cost something, and you've paid the cost, and you're still there. The building made its building sounds around them, and outside the window, Portland conducted its afternoon, and somewhere in the hospital, Thomas Aldrich's repaired aorta was doing the work that repaired aortas do, which was simply holding, day after day, doing the thing it was built for. 6 months after she started, a new sign went up outside the trauma wing. It was not a plaque, and it was not a ceremony. It was a standard hospital directory update, the kind that happened when staff changed and roles changed, and the institutional record needed to reflect the current reality. The sign listed the trauma clinical specialist. Her name. Her actual name in the standard font, at the standard size, exactly as prominent and exactly as unremarkable as every other name on the board. Jerome saw it on his way to the scrub sink and stood in front of it for a moment. He didn't say anything. He went to work. Tasha saw it and nodded once, the nod of a woman who had written something down 10 months ago because she believed it would matter and had been right. Acker walked past it twice a day and never mentioned it, which was exactly what Evelyn would have expected from Acker, and was its own form of acknowledgement. Kessler saw it and went to his office and called Wolf and said 2 sentences into the phone, and then they were both under quiet for a moment, in the way of people who have watched something come right after a long time of watching it be wrong. Flynn saw it on a Tuesday morning, in the way that she'd been given back her own name quietly, without ceremony, in the ordinary light of a building doing its job. She stood in front of it for exactly as long as it took to read it once. Then she went to work. She had never been invisible. She had only ever been unseen. Those were different things, and the difference had always mattered, and now the record said so.